fellow citizens. There are strong controversies involved. I would just refer you to the latest Eurobarometer, which has been published, showing a growing number of Europeans are concerned about this. And it's a subject that's not just important for Europeans, but also important from an international level. And I'm delighted, Madam, to welcome you here with us today. I may not shock anyone with the quote I'll be making in a moment, but when we look at the recent revelations from WikiLeaks about the international importance of the subject of GMOs in the American EU discussions, it is a subject of great concern. We also talk about patents, intellectual property rights, the fact that specifically GMOs allow for patenting a living organism, which hasn't been possible up till now. So all of these are subjects of great concern to us. So there are many points to discussion. Are they of interest for who? Do they represent profits for whom? Would other agricultural practices have greater or lesser interest in ensuring food safety? What are the costs of contamination to the traditional and organic sectors? What about the ethical discussions on the research choices? All of that is very interesting, but is not part of our subject today. Our aim today is both very simple and very complex. In fact, that's the issue of risk assessment. Risk assessment, as you know, in Europe is organized by Directive 2001/18 and in particular Annex 2 thereof. This stipulates a whole series of assessments to be made on risks in the short, medium and long term, on direct and indirect effects of genetically modified organisms, the application of the precautionary principle, amongst others. As you know, with regard to putting into crop of GMO, there's the first information given to the other member states and the Commission. If there's a disagreement to that, then EFSA carries out the assessment. Now, it's depending on how EFSA interprets these regulations and applies them is what is the subject of our debate. In 2008, the Council, in fact, demanded reinforcement of the risk assessment procedures, better take into account of the impacts of certain GMOs, better taking into account certain uncertainties as well. Since 2008, EFSA has been working on drafting up new guidelines regarding risk assessments for the neighboring environment, as well as for health in general. Now, these guidelines, are they a better progress for the application of European legislation, or on the contrary, do they represent a step backwards from existing practices which are considered to be insufficient by certain member states? This is something that we'll be discussing extremely openly and calmly today. And I'll finish up by saying, because we all have to be very concise today, I'm delighted to see that we're going to have a rather contradictory debate today. I'm amongst those who defend a public expertise with a comparing debate. That's the best way to ensure the greatest information passes to the decision makers. A consensus, silent in addition, does not allow the decision makers to work in the best conditions possible. So, first of all, for the citizens and their trust in their institutions, and then for the decision makers, this open comparison is necessary. We also need to ensure that there's a lack of conflict of interest. We're in Brussels. I won't get into the French discussions, but quite often the issue of expertise and the experts' conditions and the links between experts and private interests is a growing concern. And the reform of this has become something of great importance. If we don't want to destroy the confidence of our citizens in our experts and indeed in the decision makers, we have got to be able to have expertise which can be without question regarding the procedure and those who carried it out. I'd like to thank all of the speakers, including the members of EFSA, for agreeing to participate in this. Unfortunately, none of the GMO panel was able to be with us today because of their busy agendas, and I can certainly understand them. I do find it unfortunate, however, because I think that would have provided a great impetus to our discussion. So priority will be given to our scientific speakers, but we do also need time for debate. So George and I will be trying to stick to our timetable fairly strictly. And given that Commissioner Dalli will honour us with his presence as well, and will only be here around 5 o'clock, once he does arrive, I suggest that the four speakers take the floor again briefly to explain what they've said, so that he is aware of what's been said and not then launch into what he has to say without knowing what has gone before. And I think that would be preferable to our debate. Now, George, I'm delighted to pass you the floor.
Thank you, Corinne. Could I too thank all of you for coming along and attending this debate today. We've had very high attendance. Over 120 people had booked to come to it, so I thank you very much indeed for that. This is a very, very important issue, and one that has two sides to it, and I don't think we'll get consensus here today. But I hope the debate is going to be informative in the first instance. That's the most important thing. We all know that the future of GMO cultivation has caused heated debate across Europe, with strong opinions, as I say, on both sides of the argument. I believe it's vital for farmers, consumers and the environment that the current impasse we have in decision-making on GMOs and their authorisation, and indeed whether farmers can plant them or whether consumers can buy them in the shops or not, as the case may be, it's very, very important that we try and make sure that we see progress take place on this important issue. The aim of the debate is to hear from the scientists on both sides of the argument, but I also should point out it's not for us as politicians to decide on the science. I am not a scientist. Corinne is certainly not a scientist either. And none of my colleagues, I think, with maybe one or two exceptions, are scientists. We're elected to listen to the evidence and take decisions based on the evidence we hear from the scientists on what the best scientific facts are and what the recommendations might well be. We should also remember that decisions on food safety must be based on the best scientific evidence available. If we move away from that central principle, I believe that society runs the risk of making decisions on food safety based on what is popular rather than on the facts. And once we get into that type of territory, as certainly we discovered in the United Kingdom over the BSE crisis, then you are in very, very difficult territory whatsoever. It's impossible to give reassurance to consumers, taxpayers, about the safety of the food that they eat. So scientific fact must be fundamental in the decision-making process that, that politicians are elected to put in place. It is our role as politicians to come to a view on whether, I guess, EFSA has listened to and taken into account all of the scientific opinion, and I mean all of the scientific opinion, in making their decisions on the safety of GM crops for both the environment and the public health. We're here to decide on the evidence that we might hear, whether EFSA evaluations are robust and reflect the scientific consensus, and whether those scientists who disagree with the consensus have had their views properly taken into account, properly evaluated before EFSA come to a final decision. And it seems to me that's the fundamental question that we want to address here today. Has all the scientists' views been listened to? Have they been properly evaluated? And before decisions are taken, have they been properly listened to and fed into that decision-making process? Because at the end of the day, we need to come to a view and make decisions. I don't believe that we can keep stalling on this forevermore when the rest of the world is moving ahead and using this new science and new technology, not only to benefit economically farmers, but more importantly to benefit the environment. And that's a big, big issue that we must address. If we could move on firstly to our first speaker, and really it's to set some context in regard to what happens in Europe and what happens in the United States and other countries who have been using this technology for a good number of years. Our first speaker is Professor Martina Newell-McLaughlin, a good Scottish name, dare I say it, although she's Irish, and we'll forgive her for that. She's Director of the System-Wide Biotechnology Research and Education Program at the University of California, Davis. She's published numerous scientific articles and books, mainly in the areas of plant biotech. Her latest book was Evolution of Biotechnology, from natophians, which I have no idea what that is, to nanotechnology. In 2005, she was awarded the Irish America Science Awards as one of the top contributors to Irish American science. Could I ask you to make your presentation? You have 15 minutes. We've run over time already, but we will try and stick to the 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I'm honoured to be here, and thank you, Member Lyon and Lepage. I'm delighted to be able to address these members. Obviously, in 15 minutes, I won't be able to cover all aspects of biotechnology. What I want to concentrate on is exactly as George said, and that is that we use the best possible science when making our decision as to what we should focus on when developing a regulatory structure for agricultural biotechnology products. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of context to remind us about what is it we're doing when we do agriculture. We want to produce high-yielding, affordable, high-quality food, feed, fiber, and fuel with minimum input on the environment. And we need to remember that resources are finite, and some of our resources are disappearing at a rapid rate. And in fact, for sustainable production, we need to use the best possible technology, and we need to adapt these technologies to optimize our production while minimizing input in the environment. And one of the most interesting papers on this came from a Professor Green from the Royal Society of Bird Protection, who in a very extensive study in 2005 said, high-yield land sparing is a much better way for preserving the wildlife and preserving wild spaces and minimizing input than using what he referred to as friendly, inefficient land use farming. So I want to really put the context here that we want to use the best possible science to ensure that we meet those requirements, producing the best we can with minimum impact on the environment. And I do think in some instances the EU is pursuing a somewhat unsustainable approach if they're going to concentrate on older, less efficient technologies, and if they stop focusing on science as the way forward. So I think the two most important premises of the US regulatory framework were determined way back when we first started to look at this technology in the mid-1980s. And that is, there is no strict distinction between the health and environmental risks of plants produced using modern molecular techniques and by all the conventional breeding practices, some of which I will talk to you about in a moment. This was a National Research Council determination. These are some of the smartest people in the country that are members of the National Academy of Sciences. They reiterated this position in 2002 when they said the properties of a genetically modified plant, not the process by which it was produced, that is where the focus for our risk assessment should be based. And that has not changed since. And I think I cannot reiterate that enough to say we should focus on the product, not the process. The process is irrelevant in the final determination. It just gives us some information when making our determination of the risk of the final product. And there's three main agencies that put this into place, and all of them follow this principle. The US Department of Agriculture, which is the main area where the main agency that determines the deregulated or non-regulated status of US biotech crops. The FDA, as is implied, covers food safety and feed safety, and the EPA covers the use of pesticidal products, whether inside a plant or applied externally to plants. And all of those base their focus on the process, on the product, not the process by which it was made. And to provide another little bit of context, and I'm not going to walk you through 10,000 years of agriculture research, but just to remind people that the crops you eat today all over Europe are quote unquote not natural. We left natural products behind when we left the hunter-gatherer societies 10,000 years ago. And especially over the last 100 years, and more especially over the last 60 years, we've used a lot of invasive technologies to produce our crops. And I'll just give you some examples. We've used wide crosses since for the last 50 years. We've used mutation and irradiation mutagenesis to help nature along, because of course the products that allow us to do plant breeding are produced through natural mutations. And by deliberately using both irradiation mutagenesis and chemical mutagenesis, we can introduce novel traits into crop plants. And in deference to Member Lyon here, all of his fine Scottish whisky actually comes from varieties of barley that were produced in the Nuclear Energy Research Facility in Halliwell in England. That's true also of Irish Guinness and Irish whisky. More close to home here, Italian spaghetti likewise was mutagenized in nuclear energy research facilities after the Second World War. I would like to add that none of these methods are actually regulated. They are generally regarded as safe. And for those of you that like to eat asparagus, all modern asparagus are what's called super males. They were produced purely from the male proportion of a plant. Then you used a chemical called colchicine to double the chromosome level so they would breed true. So I have a feminist friend who will no longer eat asparagus. You may call these natural or not, but the reality from a regulatory perspective in the US or in the States, these are not regulated. They're considered older technologies and generally regarded as safe. So to me, modern biotechnology is far more predictable, far more precise, and far more controlled than any of those older technologies that we've been using extensively over the last several years to introduce crop traits into our plants. And in fact, if you're to look at the commercialization process, our number one determination, like in medicine, is primum non nocere, first do no harm. It takes 7 to 10 years to commercialize any ag biotech product. There's at least 9 specific review stages, and I'll go through some of them with you in a moment. And these crops are more thoroughly tested and more thoroughly regulated than any crop or any of those older technologies in the history of agriculture. The first herbicide tolerant soybeans to be approved went through 1,800 separate analysis tests, and I was involved in some of those as an unpaid outside observer, I have to say. Massive amounts of feeding studies have been done, and from these, I've summarized them here, in dairy, beef, and poultry, they determined that genetically modified soybeans and corn was equivalent in everything, in composition, digestibility, and feeding value to non-GM varieties. These are extensive studies that were done as the regulations were being developed. I'll go through some of the actual decisions that are made. The basic decision that's made with respect to any novel crop, whatever its source coming forward, is to see is it substantially equivalent to a product that's already on the market and that's generally regarded as safe. There's a vast amount of research going on, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. I thought it's interesting, I would show some recent studies coming out of UC Davis. Now that we have new technologies, especially our new proteomics and metabolomic technologies, we were able to go in there and look right down at the molecular level to see exactly what changes are being made. And we found that there is far greater variation with all of the conventional bred mechanisms. The most variation occurred from irradiation mutagenesis, but the least variation was actually through genetic engineering. The genetically modified plant was more, taking the Sesame Street approach, was more like its parent than any other methods that you could use to introduce a novel trait. Except, of course, for the trait you wanted in there. For sure you wanted to see that difference. In fact, there was greater variation found in the site where they were sown than there was between the genetically modified plant and its parent. And that's using the most modern techniques available to us right now in our genomics center at UC Davis. So, and very, very briefly, just mention what we look at. There's both from a food and feed safety perspective and from an environmental impact perspective. And again, to remind you, this is done for genetically modified plants. This is not done for any of those older technologies where you have gross modifications made. We look at the source of the genes. We characterize them in great detail. We look at the proteins that are being expressed by these genes. We look at history of safe use of these proteins, safe consumption. We look at the levels expressed. We look at potential toxicity, allergenicity. If this is an issue, we mostly stop at that stage. We do not go on with the notion of commercialization if there's problems there. If the initial allergenicity from a bioinformatics perspective looks like there's a problem, we do feeding studies, acute oral toxicity studies. A huge amount of research is done at that stage before it ever goes through the process of commercialization. We look at composition from the point of view of the modified plant itself, characteristics of the crop in broad detail. From an environmental perspective, we look at the ecological impacts of the introduced trait and the impact of the plant itself. So again, taking a very similar approach, we look at the proteins, the traits that are expressed, and we especially look at the propensity for any of these plants for causing any novel impacts in the environment. The notion of introducing novel weeds, we need to remember, one gene does not a weed make. In fact, the germplasm that in the context into which the gene is introduced is the most important determination of the potential for a plant to be a problem within the environment. And it's oftentimes we look at, it's often presented that we're looking at these genes in isolation. They are not in isolation. They are introduced into a germplasm background that's locally adapted and has been used for many generations within the context of these environments into which they're introduced. We look at the potential for implications of impact on non-target organisms and the potential for development of resistance. And there's very strict requirements in there to control any selection process that would allow selection for the evolution of resistance to the systems that we're using, for example, to control insects. So all of those type of risks are done over the many, many years that it takes to go from the initial determination of a candidate product in the lab, going through all of these regulatory steps. It took 14 years to get the initial insect protected corn, the initial BT corn from the lab actually to commercialization. And all of that research in the lab, in the greenhouses and out into field studies are done for each of these products as they go through. And as tough as the US system is, EFSA's is even tougher. You have some of the most stringent regulatory oversight in the world. And so that should reassure you that your interests and the environment's interests are completely protected as these products go through deregulation. If we're to look worldwide, last year, 130 million hectares of biotech crops were grown by 25 countries. The interesting story is here that over half these countries were less developed countries. And indeed, of the 14 million farmers that grew these crops last year, 13 million, a full 90% were from less developed countries. And in fact, the only region in the world that's going backwards with respect to introduction of these crops is Europe. The number went down from 107,000 hectares in 2008 to 95,000 in 2009. 57 countries at this stage have regulatory approvals in place and are going through the process of introducing these. And I really do need to warn Europe that you have to be really careful that you don't get marginalized or left behind if you don't choose to use all the technologies as I've talked about, to ensure that you can produce high quality, high value crops at an affordable level with minimum impact on the environment. And just to briefly mention some of the impacts to date from a positive perspective. Over the last 10 years, there's been a gain of about 141 million tons more food produced. And remember what Professor Green has said. This would have required an additional 43 million acres of land to be put under the plough, as was achieved using biotech approaches on the existing acreage that we have. There's been a 90% reduction in environmental pesticides, a 15.4% reduction in the actual pesticide footprint. And from a global warming perspective and climate change perspective, a really important component of this is the huge reductions in carbon sequestration. It would be equivalent to taking 6 million cars off the road in 2007. We've sequestered about another 64 million tons of carbon dioxide, primarily because there's been a switch from cultivation, which looks pretty, to no-till, which is far uglier, in fact it's called ugly farming, but is far healthier for the environment. When they looked at the organic matter, they found less compaction, better water usage, healthier makeup of the soil itself, far less fossil fuels needed because you're not driving back and over to control weeds. In fact, fossil fuel usage was down by 20 gallons per hectare. And if we look broadly, one of the big issues, as I said, that's always considered with respect to impact is the impact on non-target species. They did a very broad, 2 minutes, analysis on monarch butterflies. They're one of the issues that came up, and found monarch butterflies have actually increased in the fields of farmers that are doing biotech crops because you're not broad-spectrum spraying. BT corn has also meant a 90% reduction in fungal fumonisin. So in fact, if I was in the EU, where you have a requirement on minimum amount of contamination with these mycotoxins, the only corn that really should be approved is BT corn. Otherwise, you have to use pretty nasty fungicides to control these fungal contaminations. And speaking of fungal contaminations, blight-resistant potato, which I thought would be welcomed with open arms in Ireland. It has 2 genes from a wild potato, and it basically means you no longer have to spray even the most natural, quote-unquote, bluestone on potatoes to control for blight. They are protected with no use of any fungicides, and as I mentioned, fungicides are some of the worst chemicals we can use insofar as necessary to control blight and fungal contamination. However, this hasn't been approved, but it's estimated it would mean a saving of $4.3 billion worldwide. Our nitrogen use efficiency gene, which comes from Davis, we could use this to significantly decrease the amount of nitrogen fertilizer used. And in fact, nitrous oxide is a far worse greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. In fact, it's 300 times worse. So by introducing this gene, we could almost eliminate or hugely reduce by about 60% the need for nitrogen fertilizers. The EU itself has said that results from teams across all of the countries that this precise technology and greater regulatory scrutiny probably means biotech crops are safer than any of our other conventional production systems. And when I talk about coexistence, just to briefly mention this, we need to remember that coexistence has existed for almost 100 years. And in fact, in the seed industry, the producer seeking the higher purity for a higher value product has accepted responsibility for meeting mass market expectations. And no organic farmer has been downgraded or decertified because of unintentional presence in the US. So I leave you with this notion that if we're to follow the precautionary principle, we will never do anything for the first time. That will violate precautionary principle. I think what we have to look at is taking the best possible science to make a determination of the best possible risk assessment so we can go forward with ensuring high quality, high value, highly affordable food production with minimum impact on the environment. It has to be rational and proportional and in the interest of the environment and the members of the European Union. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Martina. I'm going to allow a couple of quick questions before we move to the next session, but you'll also get an opportunity to question Martina at the end of the first panel session when there will be an open debate for about 25 minutes or so. So I would give MEPs the floor first if they want to ask the question. If not, the first 2 hands that go up that I see, I'll take as a question. No one? No one want to ask any questions? Okay, gentleman at the back. Could you give us your name and organisation if that's relevant?
Professor Maurice Maloney. I'm the Director for Rothamsted Research in the UK. Martina, it'd be very interesting just to get a comment from you. There's a lot of regulation in Europe that needs examination. What would be your recommendation for maybe the top 2 things that are required to go under the microscope for further discussion?
I think the 2 initial comments I made, oh, sorry. Okay. Yes, sorry. The 2 original comments I made, and that is, like in the US, the focus should be on the actual product, not the process by which the trait is introduced. And secondly, to remember that using modern biotech techniques, they are subject to the exact same laws of nature as are all those older techniques I discussed, none of which are regulated within the EU as well. So to me, the most important thing from a scientific perspective is look at the risk assessment of the actual product, not the process by which it was made.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to draw that particular section to a close and move on to the first panel session. This is in no particular order, but we have Corinne Leroux, Senior Scientific Officer from EFSA and the GMO unit, who's going to speak for 15 minutes, and that then will be followed by Angelika Hilbeck, the Senior Researcher from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and President of the European Network of Scientists for Social and Environmental Responsibility. She will also speak for 15 minutes. There'll be then a couple of minutes for each of them to challenge each other or ask questions of each other, and then the floor will be open for approximately 25 minutes for questions from the floor. So could you please make sure that you're ready with questions from the floor when we get to that stage. So if I could ask you, Corinne, to begin. You've got 15 minutes, and I'll give you a warning when you're 2 minutes out, okay?
Thank you very much. So I'm Corinne Leroux. I'm Scientific Officer in the GMO unit in EFSA, and I'm going to present you the EFSA GMO panel guidance document on the environmental risk assessment of GM plant. So the general outline of the presentation is to present the update of the GMO panel guidance document, the strategy developed in the guidance document for the environmental risk assessment of GM plants, the specific area of risk, and due to time limitation, we will not have time to go through all of them, but one will be highlighted, and then one slide on post-market environmental monitoring. So the legal background for EFSA to work on GMO is the Regulation 1829 on GM food and feed and the Directive 2001/18. Since 2003, all applications have been submitted under the Regulation 1829. They can cover cultivation, but they are within the frame of the Regulation 1829. The principles of the directive are still applicable. So EFSA worked provide independent scientific advice to the risk manager. They develop and update guidance document. They provide the scientific evaluation of GMO application. And here we have just to remind that the applicant is responsible to perform the environmental risk assessment, and then EFSA or the member state, when it's delegated to a member state, is responsible to evaluate that risk assessment based on the information provided by the applicant and all available information in the scientific literature research project. And EFSA is also conducting in-depth analysis of scientific issues. So just one word to remind that the EFSA GMO panel is composed of 21 experts that deliver opinions. We have plenary meetings every 1.5 months where adoption of opinion and on guidance document are done. And the European Commission is always present as an observer. In EFSA GMO unit, there's 24 staff which provide scientific and administrative support. I'm, for example, a scientific officer working in a GMO unit of EFSA. So on the update of the ERA guidance document, EFSA received a mandate from the European Commission in January 2008, and then there was an exchange of content and timeline, and then a term of reference were agreed with the Commission in March 2008 for a 2 years project, including a public consultation. In March 2009, EFSA and some panel members presented an interim state of play to the member state in order to explain the progress. And then in June 2009, EFSA organized some stakeholder consultation in order to collect the view, first to present the step done in the work, and then also to collect the view of the different stakeholders. So we had a meeting in Berlin, 1 day with applicants, 1 day with member states, and 1 day with environmental organizations and NGOs. Between March and April 2010, EFSA organized a written public consultation, collected all the comments, and the comments were distributed in the working groups. Between June and September 2010, EFSA organized additional meetings with stakeholders, one with member states, one with NGO and environmental organizations, and one with industry, in order for the public to comment on their written comments submitted during the public consultation. And in November 2010, the ERA guidance document of the GMO panel was finalized and published on EFSA website. This is a very complex slide, but just to show the steps, the mandate of the European Commission was highlighted 4 aspects to be specifically worked out, which was the potential impact of GM plant on non-target organisms, the field trial design, the long-term effect, and the receiving environments. When the panel and the working group started to work on this update, they realized that it relates more to the whole environment risk assessment, and therefore they take on board to review the whole environment risk assessment and not only the 4 points that were highlighted, because they consider it's a global effort. So if we go to the strategy for the environment risk assessment, just to remind that the principle that have been developed in the guidance document is that the environment risk assessment should be scientifically sound and performed in a transparent manner. The case-by-case basis is a principle as well as the concept of familiarity, in which the concept of the products that are currently in the agriculture and have a history of safe use can be considered as a baseline, and then the comparative approach is to compare the GM plant with the baseline of known products. So the panel is also recommended a tier approach in the process of the environment risk assessment. This slide is to show that the panel has developed 6 steps for the environment risk assessment and asked the applicant to always follow these 6 steps, whatever the level in the risk assessment they are, whatever area they want to develop, they are asked to follow a step approach. So 6 steps are defined and need to be addressed all the time by the applicant. These 6 steps are based on the Directive 2001/18. It's a systematic requirement to address the 6 steps, but the application of each step might be on a case-by-case basis. So the first step is the problem formulation, which includes hazard identification. Then the second step is hazard characterization and an exposure characterization. The applicant is afterwards asked to discuss the risk characterization, being the combination of hazard and exposure, and then to discuss risk management strategy and overall the risk evaluation and the conclusions. So the panel has also developed in the guidance document several cross-cutting considerations, which are issues of generic nature that are horizontal and need to be considered all the time by the applicant when performing the risk assessment. One section is on the choice of comparator. This section has been developed by a working group dealing specifically on the comparator. So we have extracted the information related for the environment risk assessment presented in the guidance document. Just to remind that on this document prepared by the working group on comparator, there's an EFSA public consultation that will end by the end of this week on 15th of January, and that EFSA organized an EFSA consultative workshop on March 2011, and that expression of interest are currently open on EFSA website. The other chapter that has been developed is the receiving environments, and here the panel made a review of all the biogeographical zoning existing in Europe, but didn't refer to a specific system, but proposed a stepwise approach and asked the applicant to justify the receiving environment which has been selected for performing the field trial. So the step approach needs to take into consideration the plant, the trade, and the receiving environments and the production system. So these 3 elements must be argued by the applicant. And then there's a chapter on the general statistical principle that have been developed by another group dealing with statistics in general, and have developed a requirement for the field trial design for the environment risk assessment, and with some requirement that the applicant has to provide both a proof of difference and a proof of equivalence. They need to provide prospective power analysis of all the analysis they are providing. There's requirement for the field trial design to have 2 years replication, 3 sites, 3 replicates per site. So that's the chapter on general statistics. And on long-term effect, the panel also developed a chapter on long-term effect. This is an issue that were already present in the previous guidance, but have been extended here. The panel defined two types of long-term effect, the category 1 being the chronic exposure, an effect that you might expect in long term and in space and time. And the category 2 is the occurrence of new issue that you will not expect. It's a very difficult issue because the environment is very dynamic and there's a multi-stressor. So the panel is recommending several tools to address long-term effect. The use of experiments on long-term experiments that provide data in the field. Data from the monitoring report that are conducted and that feedback on the environment risk assessment and the use of modeling. And then there's a section on stack events, and here the panel reiterates the fact that the single event needs to be risk assessed before the risk assessment of a stack can be performed. So this slide just to remind that the overall strategy developed in the guidance is to have a systematic approach for all applicants, for all application, and for any crops and trade. There's cross-cutting consideration, 5 cross-cutting considerations that are horizontal. Then there's 6 steps in the area that has to be followed. And then in green, we have listed the 7 areas of risk, which are the areas that have to be considered by an applicant when dealing with their environment risk assessment. Due to time constraint, in the next slide, we are going to see how this approach is applied for the section on non-target organisms. So the first step is, so there's a 6th step, and then for the interaction of the GM plant on non-target organisms, the first step is the problem formulation, where you ask, what are the protection goals? What do you want to protect in your environment? How do you select your NTO species and the focal species? And how do you assess intended and unintended effect? Here the panel has considered a 4-step approach, which is in the first step to identify the non-target organism functional groups that are exposed to the GM plant. So in the receiving environments, what are the non-target organisms existing? In step 2, the categorization of the NTO species from the identified functional group. In step 3, to rank the NTO species for their ecological criteria. So here we have a concept of ecological importance, which might be the exposure, the abundance, or the sensitivity of a non-target organism. And then finally, in step 4, the final selection of focal species for each functional group. So here there's an approach that has been developed, and the applicant has to follow that approach and justify each step when selecting an NTO and when providing information on a specific NTO. At the level of identifying or assessing effect, to assess the intended effect, the panel is recommending an ecotoxicological tier approach. Means that as a mandatory requirement, the panel is asking the applicant to provide in their environment risk assessment a tier 1A in vitro and a tier 1B in planta laboratory data. Depending on the results, the applicant might provide semi-field experiments or field experiments. But the first step, which is the worst case scenario, is a mandatory requirement. To assess the occurrence of unintended effect, here the panel is recommending a weight of evidence approach and to consider information available of the plant and interaction with the environment. So everything which is available from field trial, from survey, from cultivation, that would give an information of the potential interaction of the plant in the environment. The data from the molecular characterization that provide information on protein expression. The data from the compositional analysis, where in the comparative assessment, if differences are detected, it might be an indication of unintended effect. And the analysis of agronomic and phenotypic field trials, which are systematically provided in all applications and give an indication of potential unintended effect. In step 3, the applicant is asked to proceed with the exposure characterization, and here the scope of the application will be important. A scope on application, important processing, the exposure is quite limited. It will be with accidental release or through the manure of animals fed on GMAs, while for cultivation, the exposure to NTO will be much more important. The applicant is asked, so in the guidance document, the panel is asking the applicant to consider the crop, the trade, and the receiving environments, to consider the direct but also the indirect exposure. I have my white paper of 3 minutes. To consider the exposure through B or T trophic interaction, to consider infill but also adjacent habitats, so the fill margin, and always go for a worst case scenario. Step 4 is a combination of hazard and exposure. In step 5, if risk management strategy are proposed, the panel is asking the applicant to justify the selection of risk management strategy, to discuss their efficacy, their reliability, and to discuss how the risk management strategy might reduce the expected level of risk. In step 6, there's an overall conclusion on the potential impact of plant on NTO, which have to be drawn by the applicant. The last slides for the last minute is on post-market environmental monitoring. Here to mention that the scientific opinion, EFSA presented the scientific opinion on the guidance to applicant on post-market monitoring in 2006. This has not been updated in the current ERA guidance document, but we received a recent request from the European Commission, and there's an ongoing work to update this chapter. And then the GMO panel provide opinion and recommendation on the scientific quality of post-market environmental monitoring plan provided in each application. This is a mandatory requirement. And the panel assessed the scientific information of some annual PMEM reports, and we've just started with some report from the cultivation of 2009. Thank you very much for your attention. That's the end.
Thank you very much, Corinne, and thank you very much for sticking to the 15 minutes. You were just a bit bang on time. If we can now move on to Angelika Hilbeck, Senior Researcher, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Again, it's 15 minutes, and then once we get to the end of this particular presentation, we will have 3 or 4 minutes for each of the speakers to question any of the assertions made in the previous presentations, and then we will open it to the floor for about 25 minutes of questions from the audience themselves. So, if I could ask you just to begin. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And also for me, thank you very much for inviting me and providing me with the opportunity to share our thinking on the EFSA's revised guidelines. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to discuss these issues and a good format to do so. Please pass me the 3-minute one as well, once I'm there. I hope I get through. I take on from where Corinne stopped because she already laid out a number of issues that I can skip over now. I was going to start out with revisiting the mandate that EFSA had, what was their task given to them by the Commission to do, and this is just a recap. Develop criteria for the selection of non-target organisms in consideration of the receiving environment, and likewise select and develop the proper methodologies to study and test them. And likewise develop criteria for field trials to assess the potential long-term effects and identify EU biogeographic regions which should be considered and from where those species should come from. Assess potential long-term effects. So I don't need to spend time on that, so I'm glad I can spend time on other issues. The legal status of the guidance, I think, is also an important issue to consider so that we all understand what this means once they're adopted. They need to be adopted by the member states, obviously in support with their national risk assessors. And once they are adopted, they are the law. They are the regulations by which we have to go and with we have to live. Do we like it or not? So it's quite important, and it's worthwhile to debate it thoroughly before so we all can move on and live with it confidently. I'll call it a critical appraisal, and actually I will start out my critical appraisal on the EFSA guidelines with a compliment. And we do recognize that this has been a huge task and had a lot of effort and thinking, and women and manpower had to go into that in order to revise it. We do understand that, and we congratulate EFSA on having done so. And overall, and I'd like you to keep that in mind for the rest, even if I become quite critical later on, that overall we do recognize that and consider those guidelines and the revisions a quantum leap forward and a real progress in terms of scientific rigorosity, the quality, and for the environmental biosafety. And we also recognize that this is following a call by the wider scientific community who have been calling for revisions like that since, well, at least 10 years that I can remember. And it was heard that it's rewarding and it's certainly a proper step towards confidence building that Corinne has been addressing at the beginning and to overcome and move forward in this highly polarized debate. So it's been a proper step in the right direction, and it's certainly for the greater good of the European people. So I move on to the issues, and I'll go by those 4 mandates and comment on them. And I will continue. I start with the non-target section that Katrin has also alluded and explained to you a bit more in detail, so I don't need to do that. And I continue with my appraisal, but that's probably going to be the end of it, that this is a field where the greatest progress was made. And finally, these are the issues that have, been discussed and called for repeatedly over the 10 years, that more ecological criteria are being applied to the selection, that actually species that occur in our environments in Europe are being subjected to the testing. So far it's been surrogate species, the testing procedure is totally different, and that the receiving environments of Europe are being included and considered, realistic routes of exposure, and that the testing is not only focused on the transgenic product, the purified microbially produced protein, but actually also looks into the plant and puts the GMO actually at the center of the assessment. And this has been certainly also rewarding for me to see, because much of the selection procedure that you've been outlining briefly is actually integrating a concept that a large group of international scientists has been developing, that I had the honor and pleasure to lead for 6 years together with my colleague, Professor David Ender from the US, and was funded by the Swiss government, actually. So that's the Swiss contribution to the EFSA and the European development of regulations, I consider. And so, of course, I applaud that, and we're very happy to see that this has come to fruition here in this way. The criteria for field trials in the receiving environment, the guidance recognizes the importance of that. We certainly concur with that. The guidance provides criteria for the representativeness, the practical setup, and the statistical analysis. All that is fine and good. However, the tiered approach that has been described there, you will find that in the EFSA guidelines on the page 64. To the extent possible, I've given you the references where those pieces of text are in the guidelines. We find not quite appropriate, at least in a way that we've been looking at it, but maybe we can clarify that, for approval of cultivation, which is what these guidelines are about. As you see, this is the figure that you find in the guidelines, and as we see it and interpret it, there is a possibility that, probably you can't read it, but at the first stage tier, this is lab trials in closed environments that look into non-target organisms that are being selected from those receiving environments, where testing of the protein happens, and also some testing with the plant happens, but it's still closed environments, so it could be something in a petri dish or in a small jar, and if no effects are observed at that step, it seems to me from this graph, it could move straight towards market approval. And if that is so, that would be certainly not acceptable, because as of course no developer would ever put a plant to market approval and in the field straight out of a test tube, and could not assess the target effects reliably and needs to confirm it in field trials, so you must confirm and test non-target effects obviously also in an environment. So at least there needs to be sort of a minimum set of field trials and certain safety aspects that need to be tested also in a field, and go through a stepwise procedure beginning with a lab and ending with a field testing. So the same biological rules that apply to the development of a plant and the target effect applies also obviously also to non-target effects. The identification of geographic regions and representative environments, techniques for assessing long-term effects. The guidance, as we've read it, gives examples for different zoning projects in the EU, like Natura 2000, for example. However, it has not yet identified regions that would be relevant, particularly for GMO crop production, for those plants that are out there, maize and soybean and so on. So I think there's room for further development and improvement. We have been making contribution in a project funded by the German government on that, which will be published very soon. I hope that we can continue the discussion on that. We've made concrete proposals for that. And the importance of receiving environments has been recognized, but again here, a real guidance on the details and how to go about it is yet not developed and might be coming in the future. I don't know. We hope that this would happen. The approach so far taken in the guidelines is that the applicants provide the details in their what is called a problem formulation section. Of course, that needs to be, for the important issues like that, be subjected to a wider scientific review. Now, the concerns we have, and this is actually where we have the biggest concerns. So all of what I've been saying now, I think can be, must be discussed, but is solvable. But the biggest concern we have is on Chapter 2.1, where EFSA actually introduces a new principle. And as a general principle, that's how it is phrased in the document, and that's called the comparative safety assessment. And that is actually an upstream piece decision-making step before the risk assessment is entered. That's how we interpreted it. And this comparative safety assessment, an entirely new element, is a new expression in essence or rephrasing of the concept of substantial equivalence. And this concept of substantial equivalence has so far been used in the context of GM food safety assessment. It is newly introduced now in the context of environmental risk assessment for environmental release and cultivation. And even for food, it's been ever since it's been introduced, highly controversially debated. So there's by no means a consensus on that this concept is sufficient for a safety assessment. In fact, if you read the regulations, the existing regulations for the EU right now, it seems to be in contradiction to that, because the regulation on food and feed, 1829/2003, explicitly states that the substantial equivalence is a key step in the procedure for the assessment, but it is not a safety assessment in itself. And the Codex Alimentarius uses a similar wording and phrasing, also speaks of a key step, but that it is not a safety assessment in itself, but rather represents a starting point, which is used to structure the assessment and a risk assessment. Also, the Directive 2001/18 identifies 5 general principles, and I noticed a bit of a difference in the principles that you've been laying out. Maybe we could go back and revisit in the text. We identified those were the 5 principles we could find under the heading of general principles. All of them have to be in accordance with the precautionary principle, obviously. And the 5, you can read it here, is the analysis of cumulative long-term effects, a comparison with the GMO parental plant. Here comes in a comparative approach. So the risk assessment is based on a comparative approach, but it's embedded in a risk assessment and not an upstream preceding decision step. And it's got to be obviously scientifically sound and transparent in manner and on a case-by-case basis. And if new information occurs, we have to revisit our risk assessment and consider the new evidence and do a risk assessment again. Now, with this new general principle of a comparative safety assessment, a new guideline has been introduced sort of en passant, which we're not sure can be done. So I'd like to see that this confirmed or checked by the legal advisors whether that is. It certainly is a bit beyond the mandate that EFSA had been given and whether a general principle can be introduced in such manner. And it is in effect, as it is now positioned in the scheme of things, a new step that is preceding the actual risk assessment. And there is 3 criteria have been identified as we read it, which is the determination of a consistency of an effect seen, the determination of whether the effect seen is non-transient in nature, and the determination whether the effect seen, if any is seen, is biologically relevant. Now, given with the possibility that a approval could be on the tiered approach that I've been just alluding to a few minutes ago, that you could grant approval on the basis of lab trials, if you don't see further effects, it stops there. How could you, there is no way in a scientifically sound manner that you can determine at that level whether any effect, good or bad, is consistent, non-transient, or biologically relevant. And moreover, nothing is laid out in the guidelines what biological relevance is. We would almost need a new guidance document that would lay this out and undergo a scientific review. What is a biological relevance? We have quite different views on that, and people interpret this differently. So they need to be defined, described, and reviewed, and we haven't seen that. So this is the graph. You've seen it from Corinne before. The comparative assessment as we see it and interpret it is preceding any of the risk assessments. So this, in one interpretation, could act actually as a filter to only subject those GMOs to the actual risk assessment who fulfill certain steps consistent and have already effects. So we find this a bit illogical, and also we don't understand how this is in practice gonna work. And I hope we get some clarification on that during the course of the discussion. Chapter 2.2 is also where we have some problems. It's a problem formulation. It's a guidance introduced on problem formulation. It's also a new element, but there's less controversy about that. There's been a number of scientists who have introduced that element in the concept. However, there are different concepts existing on problem formulation in the published scientific literature. EFSA only, unfortunately, recognizes approaches provided by the biotechnology industry and ignores entirely other published scientifically peer-reviewed approaches in the wider scientific literature. And this is just some of them that I put together briefly for you. This is a whole series of books have been published on this with chapters on problem formulation with various GMO applications in the context that we don't find any mention of that. So we understand that this is either they didn't know about it, which is not good for an expert group, or they ignored it intentionally, which is not good for any expert group either. So in summary, the document comes across as a bit non-coherent. I must say, in split an approach. Some sections we've seen significant progress made scientifically, broader basis of assessment, incorporates ecological principles, and in other sections we see it's quite non-progressive, narrow in scope, and ignoring entire segments of literature and scientific in the peer-reviewed literature. So if the question that was posed beginning by both of you, is this a step forward or backward? Are we moving on? Has all the literature been considered? I must say, on one part, yes, and in other parts, no, unfortunately. So our recommendations from that would then be to revisit that. We have not seen that for Chapter 2.1, the comparative safety assessment, there is really a repair mechanism for that. That needs to be discussed entirely and legally checked whether that is something that can be done, because it could be undermining sort of downstream the progress that's been made. And strictly look at what the laws say already and the guidelines that are out there, and rewriting Chapter 2.2, the problem formulation, give full and unbiased account of all the approaches that have been proposed in the scientific literature to this process. And ensuring a participatory and open process, I think this might be a first step in that, and I hope this kind of discussions and widening of the debate will happen and occur. The ultimate acid test we consider is that there could be a dry run with the guidelines ahead of time before they are actually adopted, to see how these things fall out and clarify the issues that we are unclear on, for example. And run, for example, a dry run with a stacked event where we can find, for example, in the smart stacks, up to 6 Bt toxins and the residues of 2 broad-spectrum herbicides in conjunction in one plant. That could be a very good test case to see how those guidelines that have been revised now could fall in place for the assessment. So this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angelica, for trying to stay on time. You're just right on, bang on the mark. We now have an opportunity for Corinne to respond to some of the criticisms that have been raised and probably address one of the fundamental questions that we need to ask here today as to whether there's been proper engagements with the independent scientists who are critical of EFSA and whether they've actually engaged with them and examined what they've had to say before they drew up a new guidance and there's actually been a proper process. I think that's what we need, reassurance, and then respond to the criticism. And you've got about 4 minutes. I won't let you run over that. Okay?
Thank you very much. So no, I don't receive as criticism, but as view on the guidance document and on the work performed by the panel. Just to confirm that during the process, I've tried to highlight at the beginning, during the whole process of the development of the guidance document, there were constantly consultation with the different stakeholders while we were working during the written public consultation, after the public consultation. All publication, all views, all scientific literature which are relevant have been considered, discussed in the working groups. They might not appear listed in the guidance document because some examples are given, but I can reassure that consultation with different stakeholders have been extensively done for the environment risk assessment, and we had opportunity to discuss the different views. And that literature and all scientific publication, also research project, all actions that are ongoing in the scientific community related to GMO on the principles for the environment risk assessment have been checked carefully and discussed. For the comments on the starting comparative safety assessment, we are operating under 1829. Under 1829, the concept of substantial equivalence is a basis, is mentioned as a international agreed principle, and it's the concept of the comparative assessment, which is the base of the risk assessment. Perhaps if you show me again the slide with all the structure of the document and you highlight the comparative assessment. Here we want to explain the approach for the environmental risk assessment. It's not exclusive. It's not that you go to 2.1 and then you don't move anymore. It's just the principle that you are following. You consider the GM plant in comparison with a non-GM plant with a history of safe use. That's the principle. And then you develop some steps, and that's what we have developed in 2.2 and 2.3. So there's no exclusion before starting a risk assessment that a GM plant would be safe per se. So that's just the principle that I described. And if we go to the NTO, where I've given an example of how these principles are implemented, and say, I just remind the good words of the beginning that the principles were well developed, and then that the principles are well applied.
Okay, thank you. That kept it to a very tight time scale. Angelica, you've got 2 or 3 minutes if you want to respond before we throw the questions open to the floor.
Well, we need to sit down and discuss the details. I'm not quite convinced that that's what's going to happen. I mean, as I said, we would have to actually apply it to a real case and then see what will come out of that. I'm not totally convinced that it couldn't happen that some plans will not go through this assessment if you, based on a comparative approach on compositional analysis, and these things state that these are safe. We haven't seen any non-consistent, non-transient effects, and then still subjected entirely to the risk assessment. It may be that some scientists are not quite clear themselves, who were working actually on other parts of the guidelines, that that's what could happen. So we really need to clarify that that is not possible. For me, that's a critical point, because it could be just undermining what the progress you've made in the other sections is all irrelevant if hardly any GMO makes it to this. If they are filtered out in the front because it said, oh, they're fine and safe, we had them. And that's exactly what it's not a new idea by me. I've actually heard that people would like to see that happen. And we just want to make sure, because that would in effect we would be ending up with weaker regulations than we have now. And that's certainly not what would move us forward and would ease the controversy. And
Okay.
have I said at the beginning that there was the first speaker introduced saying that we are evaluating the process and not the product? That's certainly not true. The process is a trigger for engaging, but we certainly look at the product. And I mean, all that, what you've seen here now is the product, not the process. But the trigger, which product is going to look at, is the process, how it is produced. And it's not only genetic engineers, there are other types of biotechnologies as well. Cell fusion is to a certain extent regulated. And I'd be certainly willing to engage in a wider discussion whether we include other types of technologies that might have risk associated with them into this.
Okay, thank you. The questions are now open to the floor. I'm looking for questions, not statements. You will be cut off quite quickly if you're going to stand up and make a 10, 15-minute presentation of your views. MEPs and members are entitled to first go, and I know Corinne is keen to ask first. What I'll try and do is maybe take 3 questions at a time. And can you tell us which speaker you want to respond, because Professor McLaughlin also is available to respond to any questions that members have. Once I've got members, then I'll move on to the rest of the audience. So Corinne first. Is anyone else? Gentleman there.
Ma question est pour vous, Madame.
A question for Mrs. Lare. I must say I totally agree with Mrs. Hilbeck, you know, on the principle of equivalence, what she said about that. I think, to me, that's perfectly clear. I don't think we should put a block on things just to avoid evaluating substances later on. Anyway, the question is this. In the directive, there are very clear obligations on this study on receptor environments and on biosurveillance. That's to say, what happens subsequently. As far as I know, the number of studies carried out in both areas are almost inexistent in number. Now, do you think these guidelines will make it possible for you to change something and to apply the directive on these points?
Yes, Robert Goebbels, MEP, ALDE Group. Ma question s'adresse à Madame Hilbeck.
My question is to Mrs. Hilbeck. She stressed the need to not just rely on laboratory tests, but also to field tests. Now, how do we do this in a country such as France, where the slightest GMO plot planted anywhere is immediately ripped up by our colleague José Bové and his acolytes? How do we do any sort of field tests under those circumstances? And then in the written report from Mrs. McLaughlin,
approximately 30,000 field trials have been conducted on 100 organisms in 45 countries. There has not been a single report on any unexpected or unusual outcome. J'aimerais bien savoir si vous avez connaissance.
I'd like to know whether you're aware of any specific cases where anyone has fallen ill or died following contact with GMOs.
Yeah, I have 3 questions. First, to both panelists. Oh, my name is Mute Schimpf. I'm working for Friends of Europe. I have 3 questions. The first question is to Angelika and to Corinne. There had been, as we learned in the US, during the application of a new GM organism, where treated as an insecticide, as a pesticide. Will the new EFSA guidelines will fully comply with the current pesticide assessment as we have it in the EU? This is the first question to both of you. My second question is to Angelika. The environmental ministers have anonymously concluded in December 2008 that there's a long list of needs for the improvement of the whole EFSA and quality and risk evaluation. Do you think the current draft of a guidelines would fulfill and comply at least the risk assessment demands from all European environmental ministers? And then my last question is, in Norway, GM law, they have, as part of a risk assessment, one criteria that if a GMO is already authorized and some years later we receive scientific proof that the GMO cause risks, the applicant must guarantee and table a plan how to withdraw the GMO. How this can be secured in the EFSA, guidelines, or what must be changed in our European law to guarantee this?
Okay. I'll give you each an opportunity to respond to the questions. Okay. But again, conscious of time, because there's a lot of people wanting in for questions. So if we could have brief answers to the questions, if that's possible.
So to answer the first question, Madame Lepage, the concept of substantial equivalence is really a concept which is internationally agreed and which is referred in the regulation 1829 as a concept for the risk assessment of GM food and feed. We have, during the consultation with the different stakeholders, heard about the concern, but the panel is following the requirement of the regulation 1829 and the concept which is at international level agreed. On the concern with the milieu récepteur, so the receiving environments, the guidance document highlights clearly that the applicant has to define where the plant with the specific trait might be grown. And is there difference in management production that will push to define several receiving environments to take into consideration the practices around. So there's a concern to really identify adequate receiving environments, even several of them, when doing the environment risk assessment. For the post-market environmental monitoring, so the studies that are followed when a product is authorized, that is mandatory in the application on the 1829. So it's something which is systematically required to the applicant. And depending on the outcome of the environment risk assessment, or a case-specific monitoring is requested, which is hypothesis-driven, or in all the case, mandatory is a general surveillance, so which has to be provided.
Yes, I'll check that on.
Yeah, good.
Okay. Are you done?
I should continue.
Yeah, I think you should. Clearly, you can't answer the second one, but if you respond to the third question that was put as well, and then we'll ask Angelica to respond as well.
So the issue which is asked on the pesticide, and it's really the interplay between the directive on 1829, which is GMO plant and GM food and feed, and the regulation on the pesticide, the 91414, and the updated regulation. There's an interplay between the two of them, and the panel is assessing the GM plant with all its characteristics, being herbicide or tolerant, herbicide tolerance or insecticide resistance. At the level of the management and the impact of the management or the impact of the herbicide, it's considered in one of the item which is listed in mandatory item in the guidance document. It's the impact of cultivation and management of the crop. Here it's the interplay with the directive 912414, and the applicant is requested to justify how it's going to cultivate. Is it going to be a different use of herbicide? What will be the doses? What active substance will be provided? So that interplay between the two directives is addressed in that chapter of the guidance document. And I think I will end here.
Angelica, do you want to take on
Okay,
the questions that were directed at you?
The field tests and destruction of field trials. Well, obviously that is a question that cannot be answered scientifically. That is a legal question, a political question, a trust-building confidence question, a sociological question. That's the field where this needs to be answered and tackled at that level. So there is no scientific remedy for that, I'm afraid. Whether anybody had died is a long similar lines. Obviously, that's not even something I think about at this point, because we want to avoid any kind of harm. I mean, we are operating under the precautionary principle, and we want to avoid that harm can happen to the environment and definitely to human beings. So I'm thinking about things much more upstream there, to say. So and whether people have died or not is beyond my capacity to answer. You would need studies and experiments and whatnot for that. So that cannot be scientifically answered as well. And I suppose you are aiming for the health issue there, but I think we will be discussing health issues and what evidence has been put forward in this field in the next panel. Other publications, the citations on field trials that have been done, of course I am aware of them. I'm working in this field since 16 years, and I think I have a command of this field. What the issue is that you find reviews who look at data from one perspective, and then you find reviews who look at the very same data from another perspective, and they come to opposing conclusions. That is something we find in this field quite often, and actually we always find it. So there is field trial, depending what you cite, you find reviews who come to that conclusion, and then there is just as many other reviews who come to a different type of conclusion. There are also field trials that find differences. There are field trials who confirm pesticide reduction, and there are field trials who confirm pesticide increase. There are field trials and reviews who find that biodiversity has gone down or is going down in BT fields or in sprayed fields. It depends what type of biodiversity you look at. It depends on how you screen it. This is a highly complex field where there is no single clear and straightforward answer. It depends how you do it, what you look for, when, and what you consider an effect. That's often where it starts already. So there is no simple answer to that, and that is part of the discussion and of the controversy, and that's what we need to overcome in larger, involving the wider community and the wider scientific community in answering these questions. There was a question on the list of environment ministers. I'm not sure I understand which list that is. I don't have that list in front of my eyes right now, so it's hard to say whether they comply with that or not. I'm afraid I can't answer that really satisfactorily. The Norwegian law has its interesting peculiarities. One is that, another one is ethical considerations as well, and so withdrawing a GMO, once you find out that something went wrong, it's just by the nature of it, will always be highly, highly difficult, if not impossible, depending what type of plant you're dealing with, how much it spreads, and what type of biology and ecology it has. We've been seeing with some of the cases where illegal releases and escapes from field trials or fields have happened, that it proved very difficult, and that some of the events are still with us years after that, although their production has been stopped immediately after it, or they were only in one-year field trial. Just remember the rice event, remember the flax event, remember the Cry9C event, the Starlink event. So these things were with us and may still be with us today, although we tried to withdraw it. So that's by the nature of it. That's why it says in the EU regulation right up front that given that this is biological organisms that are capable of reproducing by themselves and live autonomously outside of our control, this is difficult and in some cases impossible. That's why precaution is important, and that's the difference to chemicals and any other type of intervention in nature. In that case, always the line will go down. It may take a while, but it will, when we stop applying it, it will eventually go away. With these organisms, we have no control over that. So I think I've answered it. So, and the guidelines aren't finished. So I still consider them work in progress. There is obviously room for improvement in some of the issues and the identification of biogeographic regions and understanding their representativeness for GMO production and so on, all need continuous work and need more work. So for me, this is not the end of the story yet. So
Okay, I've got a gentleman, MEP there, just wants a quick rejoinder, and then I've got two here who want to ask a question next.
Merci.
Thank you. Well, I don't think Mrs. Hilbeck has answered my question. Yes, the precautionary principle does exist, and we need to be cautious in life, but we are nonetheless in a world where we have 25 countries. We represent more than half the global population. They've been familiar with GMOs for more than 20 years. I mean, if there were any health problems, we surely would have heard of something somewhere.
Gentleman then, can you tell us name and organisation?
My name is René Kusters from the Public Regulation and Research and Regulation Initiative, and also from the Flanders Institute for Biotechnology. I would like to voice a concern about the development, about the EFSA guidelines now and the proportionality of those guidelines, where a number of scientists are a little bit concerned about how now these guidelines are more elaborate, that there are more things are coming into these guidelines which may be under the category of nice to know instead of need to know. And that there is a little bit of a danger that through these guidelines and the execution of these guidelines are more learning about the impact of farming on the environment than more specific on the GMO issue. So I'd like to have a comment on that.
And the next gentleman sitting beside. Yeah, third question.
Well, my question, Klaus Ammann is my name. My question is if anybody from the panel could, or from the audience, could name me a scientific paper published in a peer-reviewed journal who makes a basic difference in the genomics between GMOs and non-GMOs. I would really love to see this paper. And another remark, talking about environment and Angelica, this is certainly a complex matter. But to leave out in your analysis statistics is just non-scientific. I think the element of statistics to evaluate an environmental impact paper or benefit paper is certainly crucial.
Do you want to respond to these questions specifically? Angelica, do you want to respond to and then carrying on to the complications on the guidance, and in particular the concern about the evidence of from other countries of any incident?
Well, it's part of the discussion that there is these nice to knows and need to knows, that we disagree on that, and that there is different views on them. Learning on farming rather than learning on GMO, I think you cannot separate that. And we do learn, and it's good that we learn with that, because that technology is still fairly young. And given its potential impact and its potential to stay with us, a learning component is crucial in my view, and certainly not a drawback on any type of guidelines. I didn't quite understand what you were saying, Klaus, on genomics of GMOs and non-GMOs. I don't understand what you were asking there. And I didn't leave out the...
There is a vast literature about, on the process level, there is no difference between a GMO and a non-GMO organism. And you can shake your head, Gilles, but you don't know the literature. It's, for instance, Werner Arber has published since 20 years as a Nobel Prize winner, and he knows what genomics really are. And there are Shuri, there are Batista, there is Baudo, there are big names in the science who come up with the statement that actually the American way of looking at the product is much better than the process.
you want to answer that specific question and then answer the
Yeah, right.
the
We're
colleague
looking
there?
at the product. I repeat myself. I said the process is a trigger, but then, of course, we look at the product. And genomics is one way to look at it. And you look at the phenotype as well, at the effects outside. I haven't said this is irrelevant. I really don't quite understand the essence of that question. And I didn't leave out statistics.
Address it to you personally. I addressed it to everybody.
Good.
And I addressed to you the question about the complexity of the environment and the statistics.
Yes, and I didn't leave out the statistics. The statistics, I addressed that in my talk. This is not a statistical review. I gave a review on the guidelines. So statistics are, of course, important. They have been addressed. And I can go over and do a statistical analysis or review of the statistics put forward in the EFSA paper. That's all fine. But those were the points I focused on. Yeah, that's it.
I think just to final the question that my colleague posed about evidence from other countries of damage.
Oh, well, as I said, it depends what you define damage. There is damage from our environmental point of view. For example, we see resistances arising in a number of countries now. Those resistances arising against certain Bt toxins in South Africa, for example, in India, for example. In South Africa, the example I'm very familiar with, triggers now the use of pesticides to the degree as before. Along with that comes, of course, the environmental impacts that go along with pesticide use. In fact, the only difference is that we have now Bt toxin and pesticides in these plants. We have enormous environmental damage in Argentina, for example, with the rise of resistant weeds now and the increase in sprays that it requires. We have seen secondary pests moving in, replacing the primary pests that had to be battled in China, so the pesticide use is rising there as well. So we can go on. It depends what your point of view is. Some people say that has nothing to do with GMOs. Environmental scientists tend to say that has to do with GMOs and that has health relevance, and that is important. Secondly, we have, with the technology now, residues of broad-spectrum herbicides in the harvested products, in soybean, for example, that poses an additional issue of residual pesticides in feed and food that need to be addressed, but my colleague here will do that in the next panel. So I would like the health issues. I think it's a more appropriate place to address that in the next panel. This was about the environment.
Could you just deal with the proportionate issue in relation to the guidance? And then I'm going to take 3 last questions before we bring this session to a close.
Yes, I'm happy to come back on this issue because I think that the science is evolving. The knowledge and the methodology are evolving, and a guidance document, which is issued in 2010, needs to take into consideration this involvement in science, this involvement in methodology, and the experience gained on application. Currently, on all application for cultivation, there's a delegation which is initially done to the member state. So the member state performs the risk assessment and then the panel. In both cases, panel as member state systematically ask additional questions to the applicant in order to have a more complete set of information. So these guidance allow to give a strong environment risk assessment, which are harmonized among applicants and among application, which are hypothesis basis, where the applicants provide a systematic approach, give exactly the rationale for their decision, analyze the results, provide information on the hypothesis given, what are the uncertainty, and this allows to have a harmonized risk assessment, which is a quality for the authorization, which is done afterwards by the member state. So I'm not quite happy to hear that it's nice to know when we talk about requirements for a good quality of environment risk assessment. Moreover, in the guidance document, there's minimum requirement, but it's the strategy which is developed. Not all the requirements are required for all the plants and all the trade. It's apply the strategy on your specific crop and trade.
Okay, I've got 3 more people who want to place questions. Could I just add one tuppence worth just into this as a farmer. Resistant weeds and resistant pneumonias, etc., are well known through normal plant breeding and animal breeding have been forever and a day. It's one of the great challenges. Mother Nature's not benign in this one. Gentleman at the back, and then lady there and the lady behind.
Thank you. It's Maurice Maloney from Rothamsted Research in the UK. The complexity of the regulations is for GMOs in Europe is probably only matched by regulations around pharmaceutical development. And yet, even in pharmaceutical development, we do have between Europe and many other countries shared dossiers of information in order to simplify the process of drug registration. My question then to the panel is, would it not make sense for the European community to look at a situation where shared dossiers were put together? Because even with the complexity as we've seen today, probably 80% of the work has been done somewhere else anyway, and has been done under good agricultural practice, the equivalent of GMP in agricultural sense, so the quality control data. And then specialist work would need to be done to look at specific environments. I just wonder how the panel feels about that idea.
Mon nom c'est Veliki et je suis.
I'm a physician and a computer expert, and I'm also a normal consumer. I have some concerns regarding the GMO plants. My question is as follows. What are the information, statistics, and research regarding the impact of these plants on humans and animals? Now, I'm talking about people of good health and those who are already suffering from chronic diseases such as diabetes, for example. This research needs to have been done in the last 5 to 10 years, and very specifically, how many people and how many animals have been tested with these plants? Thank you.
One other question at the back there, and then we're going to draw this session to a close.
Hello, Noah Simon from the European Beekeeping Coordination. I have three very target questions. One is if...
Very targeted.
Yeah, very.
Everyone else's, this is one.
Yes. No. Is there an independent validation of the studies presented by the applicant? This is one. Then, when talking about long-term studies, what exactly is the time frame that we are talking about? How many months? I mean, what is considered? And then the third one for the post, like the monitoring post, what is that? Like the monitoring, well, post authorization, yeah, post marketing. Is this data available for the public anywhere? Thank you.
Okay. Could we start maybe with Corinne? You want to take on these questions?
Yes, the validation of the studies. So in the guidance document that would cover environment like food feed assessment, the panel is, or the guidance require the applicant to provide all studies in the form of good standard practices. But in addition, any studies are assessed for their validity for the scientific point of view. So it's asked to follow a requirement of standard operational procedure for a study. But anyway, all studies are assessed for their how the science has been developed and how the study has been performed. So independent validation, the panel is assessing each study which is provided in the application and use also publication of studies which are in the scientific literature. The duration of the studies, it depends really on the studies we are talking about. So in the guidance document, the new guidance document, for example, requirement for field trials are to have 2 years field trials. And for the NTO, when you want to assess if there's a specific effect, there's studies which are done on a growing season, which will be 1 year for the agronomic and phenotypic characteristic. So it depends on the type of study, the duration.
Okay. Research and impact on food and animals?
Yes, perhaps that question, I don't know if we will address in the second panel, because it's really food, feed, human and health, animal health related.
The shared dossier question?
The shared dossier question. The panel does not work in isolation. The panel works with a huge network in the member state, collaborating with member states in the context of cultivation files. So we collaborate with 8 member states on 18 applications currently. There's a network of exchange between the panel and representative of member states. That's a network of risk assessment methodology. And we also have a secure system, electronic system, with more than 200 members of the member state that are accessing the application and commenting on each dossier and making reference to their own experience and to their own assessment report when they have done. It's not the question. Okay.
Right.
I don't think you're answering the question, because I'm not asking about shared dossiers within member states. I'm talking about internationally in the same way that we do with drug development.
Yes. There's some contact with international organization, and there's also exchange if dossiers are assessed between the different organizations, but I'm not aware of more deep exchange of assessment.
Corinne, you want a quick last one, then I'm going to wrap this up. We're moving to
Very brief question. It's unfortunate you weren't able to answer the lady's question, but I suppose we'll come back to that in the health studies. I'm sorry, Madame Leroux, you haven't answered my question. My question is not what there is in books. My question is what is there in real life. For 10 years since the directive has been applied and authorizations have been given, I'd like to know whether there are any sort of studies done on the receiving environment. Has there been any sort of studies on biovigilance? And I'd like to know whether there have been any dossiers regarding this and whether these studies are therein. I mean, I would expect that if you're writing these guidelines before they are adopted, that this must be included. Are you willing to reject a dossier if these studies are not included or not? That's a very simple question.
If we are talking about the report from the monitoring, that
Je parle des dossiers.
I'm talking about specific dossiers, files of real life that are given to you that EFSA assesses. As far as I know, no, but I'm just asking you to convince me otherwise. I haven't seen any evidence of the receiving environment, vigilance studies haven't been done in the last 10 years. Are you going to refuse to deal with these dossiers if the studies are not supplied? If they are supplied, where are they so we can all see them?
Non, je voulais juste dire qu'on n'a pas...
No, I just wanted to say that we don't have a lot of crop authorization for, as you know, we have the corn and the potato and flora. Now, in those dossiers, there was a monitoring plan supplied by the companies, and the monitoring plan is now being assessed by EFSA each year. Amflora, it's going to start, and for Money 110, it's currently being done. Now, obviously, a dossier submitted from a company, I mean, there are other dossiers in the pipeline, that's not going to be accepted if there's no monitoring study in there. It's not going to be accepted. I mean, it might fall at the beginning of the assessment process by the member state rapporteur, or at worst by EFSA when EFSA gets its hands on the dossier, but it's not going to be considered as a valid dossier.
Okay, thank you. I think we can bring this session to a close. You've got a chance to ask questions at the end of the next panel session. Can I thank both our speakers for answering the questions and for making the presentations. And I'll now hand over to my colleague Corinne, who will chair the second panel session. As I say, those who haven't managed to get a question will get a chance the next time.
Alors nous allons...
Thank you, first of all, George. and I'm delighted he was as efficient as he was, and I hope I can be as efficient in this second panel. Could I please ask you to take your seats and be a bit quiet? Now we're going to be talking about risk assessments for food and feed, so you'll be able to get a response to the questions you put, madam. And first of all, I'll give the floor to Professor Gilles-Éric Serralini, who's president of the Scientific Council of IFIGEN, for 15 minutes, Mr. Serralini.
Thank you very much to the organizers for this debate, important debate. Now we'll talk about the real world. If everything would be perfect in a perfect world, it would be known not only by the lobbyists and the industry lobbyists. And we are talking about not the issues of the future guidelines, which are not applied yet, but the issues of the present guidelines in order to see how they were applied for the actually cultivated GMOs, because these GMOs and the resulting stacked events will be the major GMOs in the world for the next years. Who is responsible for that? For sure, not only EFSA, but also the company of biotech that are developing GMOs. I have heard a lot of things about GMOs in the last 15 years, and most of the time that GMOs are perfect and perfectly assessed, and there is just the fear of people, which is in fact making the issue that we are in a complete failure in Europe because we reach only 0.05% of the agricultural world in GMOs. The goal was 50% in 2000. So it's a complete failure for the GMOs, and it's just due to the fear of people. It's not rational. Of course, this was studied extensively, in particular in the 6th framework program by the European Commission we participated in CRIGEN, and it was called Participatory Science and Scientific Participation, on the role of civil society organizations and civil society in decision-making about novel developments in biotechnologies. And we understood that it was not fair, it was just a rationality, because people do not have need actually for the actually cultivated GMOs. More than that, there is no long-term assessment available for them, and it came as a big progress, but it was not possible to know where it was in the plate. So it was just a bad dossier, and for a lot of people, and that is why they were not developed. And I'm afraid that the states are marginalized in this rezoning because more than 150 countries have signed the so-called Cartagena Protocol on the respect of biodiversity, where GMOs are included, and people want at least labeling or traceability at the border, which is not produced, which is not performed in the States. And now, when things when people do not want to enter arguments in the debate, they say that, oh, these scientists are alone, isolated. I'm afraid that 1,200 researchers and doctors from 30 countries have signed in support of not only my studies, but also on the necessity of controversy and transparency in this debate. Because a lot of scientists are unhappy with the actual, not the guidelines by themselves, although they could be improved, and there is good work in this, but also on the real application of the guidelines product per product. And this is what we will see now. We have been working together with some governments or some NGOs or some groups like even the EU on the analysis of the efficiency goals and the independent analysis of their assessment for the actual GMOs. Our conclusion is that transparency of the raw data, including like to answer to the question of the gentleman. In order to have the blood analysis of the agricultural worker in the field trials, or to have epidemiological study, or to have traceability of the field trials, this doesn't exist. This is why we cannot answer to your question scientifically. And even I've read quite a few of these reports in field trials, and there is no real environmental survey nor health survey of the agricultural workers, and this is because there is no traceability of the field trials, just because nobody except the company has the capacity to assay the GMOs that are present in the field trials, which are quite often several combinations of GMOs in development. So now, nobody has said yet that for the environmental GMOs, I mean the GMOs developed in the environment at large scale, we have only 100% pesticide plants. That means plants designed to contain new pesticide residues, either Roundup in 80% of the case, which is a major residue which was not so much, which was a little bit, but which was not so much in the edible plants before, and glyphosate-based residues in general, some other, like glufosinate-based pesticides in some cases, and also metabolites and Bt toxins that have been modified by the companies in order to be produced by the plants at very good and important levels. So 62% are pesticide plants due to herbicide tolerance, 16% due to insecticide production, and 21% do both. And all the rest is just advertising. So we should be very careful in the debate to separate the advertising, the commands, the future hopes, and the reality today. And the scientific debate is to speak about reality first. So GMOs are cultivated in the world by the end of 2009. It's about 8.9% of world cultures. That has been progressing by around 1% since the last year per year, 1 or 2%. It's 18% of the total agriculture in the US, and 97% of edible GMOs are produced in America, where the traceability doesn't exist really much, and where the labeling doesn't exist, and where the long-term effects are not published. I'm talking about the long-term effects with blood analysis in mammals, for instance. Don't forget that these mammals are not only part of the health test, but also part of the environmental risk assessment, just because the non-target species are also small mammals and big mammals, not only from laboratory, but in farms. So 0.05% of the agricultural, of the European agriculture are in GMOs today. So it's true that we have no much experience. To answer to the question, of course, the post-monitoring plans are in the file, but not the results of these post-monitoring plans. They are not implemented, really, not even from the MON 10, to my knowledge. But if you have that, please put that on your website. And especially in different areas of the world, because we have data from, actually we could have data from other countries outside Europe. So we have transgenic soy, which is designed to contain high levels of herbicide residues. Up to 400 ppm have been authorized in the States in food or feed, in some Roundup Ready tolerant GM. And of course, the reason why these plants have been modified is to be able to absorb and to tolerate greater residues of an herbicide. It's kind of bizarre that unless you consider that this herbicide is completely environmentally friendly, which is not the case, it is bizarre to think that it is a way to reduce herbicides to make plants like that. The other part are transgenic maize producing their own insecticide toxin, and it is an insecticide, whatever some people say, produced around a kilogram per hectare. And these insecticides are new. They are not comparable to insecticides that are not authorized to be eaten and that are natural insecticides from Bt toxins, and even these ones should go through this process, but also they are not comparable to the natural insecticides produced by bacteria from the genes of the Bt, because the genes have been modified and the protein has been modified in the plant. For instance, for the Bt176, there is a difference between the insecticide produced by the bacteria, which is here, and the insecticides produced by the plant, so we should go through a whole pesticide assessment for these products. This has not been performed, and the insecticide is 44% different. So what is really done on the file, case per case? In the States, I'm sorry that there is no traceability and no epidemiology published. If somebody knows a good paper, he should say that and put that on the web. In regulatory tests, of course you have molecular characterization, but just before putting that in the plant and not after, only at the borders in sometimes, but the labeling system in Europe has shown that there were mutations in the insert that have been entered inside the plant. After you have the compositional analysis, it's good to know, the in vitro recombinant protein digestion, which is quite of theoretical consideration, but it's good to know. Computer allergenicity screening, good to know, but still theoretical. Acute toxicity testing with recombinant proteins with a few mice, and sometimes in vivo tests, most of the times 45 days on chickens, sometimes 90 days in rats, but not with the recent stacked events, for instance, and that's it. So if there is no long-term test in mammals with blood analysis. So we cannot be scientifically assessing a GMO on a long term for 450 million Europeans without being able to say to the people that this has not been tested more than 3 months on rats. And maybe it has been tested on cattle, but we still don't have, sir, the blood analysis in cattle. So how can a farmer can be not requesting this blood analysis in cattle on the long term before giving that to his cattle? Of course, we all agree that people will not die eating GMOs immediately because it is not a poison on the short term. But what about the side effects on long term? So here is a proposal for the EFSA in order to show that there are bettering possibles, there are improvements possible. We have shown that on 23 parameters measured by Monsanto on MON 863, there were some statistical findings on blood sugar, triglyceride, livers. Everybody admits that today, even EFSA. Even Monsanto saying that we have seen statistical findings, but they were considered as not biologically relevant. Why is that? Just because they said the effect should be similar between both sexes. It is on the abstract of the paper that I've shown to you. They should be proportional to the 2 doses. Normally, the OCDE standards request 3 doses in order to know if you are linear, transient or not. This has not been done for any, I'm sorry, well-known agricultural GMOs. And we should be over an historical norm which is not defined, etc. So do we have here scientific criteria? Our answers for a lot of scientists will be no. We just have some data. So, of course, this is acknowledged by the company, and I'm afraid that it is acknowledged also by EFSA. How subchronic and chronic health effect can be neglected for GMOs because we don't have mid or long-term blood analysis, and because we neglect all the first signs that could be the indication of long-term diseases. Chronic disease, we are almost all suffering from chronic diseases. And of course, for instance, the lifespan in the States is not greater than any country, not than in France, for instance. Could that be due to GMOs, to other practices, or to social issues? I mean, all questions can be raised. And for instance, it is weighted for same effects in both sexes. This is almost ridiculous, since the effects in males and females, the kidney and liver parameters in males and females are different from the beginning in the Monsanto test. So we cannot wait for a similar effect in both sexes, unless you talk about poisoning, direct poisoning. So we've published a lot of things about that, even effect in the NK603. So you can say it's not enough, it's not, but then just follow the same test for another couple of months or another year or two, and this is done for drugs, this is done for some pesticides, and you will see what happens if you want to issue this debate, to go out of these debates. So we have summarized a lot of papers from all over the world where the GMOs were tested for a few months only, unfortunately, and we have seen that in 42% of the cases where there were disturbed parameters, 9% of the parameters were disturbed, and 42% of these 9% were in the kidney or the liver, which are the detoxifying organs. So there may be something there. And example of what transparency shows, we need transparency. EFSA recognized the insufficiencies of Monsanto statistics, but recognize significant effects, but they consider, like Monsanto, that these are not biologically relevant. So there is an harmony between the EFSA panel, the previous EFSA panel, and the industry on that topic. And the debate is that here are the critical parameters, here how we can improve that. We can improve that, because in our world, we have not taken into account the long-term effects for most of the products, it's true, and GMO is just an example beyond others.
Can you conclude, please?
Yes, I'm just concluding. Thank you. What are the explanation of the effect? It could be due to the residues of pesticide in the plants. You have here at least 5 papers, 4 plus another, which is published right now, on the effect of pesticides residues on human cells. For instance, who has published effect of the modified beta toxins out of the plants on human cells? Nobody yet. This is a shame. And we see that for the Roundup residues, we have effects at very, very low levels. Embryonic human cells on the left. Disrupting effect at levels which are 800 times less than what is allowed in some GMOs in the States. So my conclusion is that we need overall full transparency on the raw data. I'm happy that the European Commission has accepted that. We need chronic tests in order to be scientifically sound, otherwise we will always turn around the fire. And we need labeling and traceability, including products from animals having eaten GMOs. We don't have that yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Très bien. Madame
Mrs. Paoletti from EFSA in the GMO unit. You have the floor for 15 minutes.
Merci. Thank you for giving EFSA the opportunity to come here and present the guidance for the food and feed risk assessment of GMOs. As soon as I have my presentation up, you slideshow there. Thank you very much. So let me start framing it a bit, our topic, into the legislative context. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Regulation 1829, but just to underline that EFSA receives the dossier via a member state, and as soon as it arrives in EFSA, we start the consultation. As soon as it's valid in EFSA, we start the consultation with the member states, and this happens for all applications. So all the information, confidential and non-confidential, is assessed by EFSA with the support of the member states. In particular, in case the scope of the dossier covers also cultivation, we have one member state performing the initial evaluation of the environmental risk assessment carried out by the applicant. The final product is an EFSA opinion, which then is delivered to the European Commission, which, with the member states, decide to authorize or not authorize. So this, again, the clear separation between risk assessment and risk management. We do work in a time frame. We have 6 months to deliver an overall opinion. There is a mechanism, which is a clock, to stop this time when the panel requires additional information to the one already provided in the dossier. And this happens in over 90% of the cases. So it's a very thorough and detailed scrutinizing of all the data. And then the overall opinion has different components. I want to highlight Annex A, which is the scientific opinion, but also Annex G, which are all the member states' comments received by EFSA during the consultation period. And each comment is answered by the GMO panel, and this is published in the overall opinion. What is the objective? Is to evaluate, which is the responsibility of the GMO panel, the risk assessment done by whom? By the applicant. So they are responsible to provide the panel all the data necessary to carry out the risk assessment. How is this done? It's based on the pillar of the comparative approach. This has already been discussed today extensively. But the foundation is to compare the GMO with a non-GM counterpart grown under the same condition. So this is a clear approach which is embedded in the Regulation 1829. So EFSA is just doing what is required by the legislation. What do we look for? Well, of course, we have said the intended effects that are those occurring because of the genetic modification, but also we control if there are unintended effects, which are additional possible effects which were not the objective itself of the genetic modification. The logic is quite clear, is that traditionally cultivated crops are well known, so this is the concept of familiarity, and have gained a history of safe use for the environment, the consumers, and the animals. And these crops, with a history of safe use, are the baseline for the environmental and food feed safety assessment. So this is, in practice, the concept of substantial equivalence, which is well expressed also in the Regulation 1829, where it said that we should show that the characteristics of the food are not different from those of its conventional counterpart, having regarded natural variation, which is a key point because this is one of the points on which EFSA has built a lot of new science to address this issue mentioned in the regulation. What are the information required in every application? Well, we have a guidance, the guidance of EFSA for the food feed risk assessment, which has different points. It requires general information, characterization of both the donor and the host plant, a very detailed molecular characterization, assessing the stability of the insert and all bioinformatic similarities with other known toxins or allergens. We address the agronomic characteristics. We have a thorough evaluation of the food feed safety in terms of nutrition, toxicology, and allergenicity. And we require specific data on all these. I have summarized below a little bit a time frame for the development of this guidance, and the dates are not so important, but what is important to understand, this is an evolving scientific document because it's not written in stone, and science evolves, and consequently also the guidance documents picks up on the most recent scientific findings. Here you have a little bit of a more detailed list of the issues that are considered and for all of which the applicant needs to provide data in its dossier. We have the functional consequences of the genetic modification, the potential toxicity and allergenicity of gene products, plant metabolites, and the whole GM plant. This is not only done via bioinformatic testing, but also in practice with real allergenicity test and nutritional and toxicological assessment. We have addressed the influence of processing on the properties of the food and the feed, and potential for change in dietary intake, and potential for long-term nutritional impact. So it's fairly detailed, and it doesn't leave open any issue. Having said that we operate within the frame of a very detailed guidance document, we also need to mention that we work on a case-by-case approach, and is not contradictory to having a general guidance. The case-by-case concept kicks in when you think that we need to assess the GMO with respect to the intended use, and in light of the evaluation of all available scientific information. So we look not only at what is delivered by the applicant in the dossier, but we look also at all the study available in the literature, just to make sure that we don't miss any scientific information. And as I said before, if the panel decides to ask further questions, we have the opportunity to do so and go back to the applicant. Now, as I mentioned before, we have an evolving scientific document because science and technology evolve, and therefore the food feed guidance is currently now being updated to provide more details on the required information, to clarify even further what are the requirements for stacked events, where stacked events is an event in which we have more than one change on transformation inserted in the same plant. We have new and detailed requirements for both the experimental design of the field trials and the statistical analysis of the results obtained from those field trials. We make reference to standardized protocols for toxicity testing as much as possible. And we have a more detailed section on when the performance of animal feeding trials, the 90-day studies we were referring before, are needed. We have further details on the nutritional assessment, and each section has a more detailed introduction and conclusion to clarify why certain requirements are in the guidance. Just to illustrate some of the changes, the first example is the new statistical approach. We have a 2006 guidance, so let's call it the current guidance, which is going to be substituted by the new one in this year, in 2011. We have, in the 2006, we have a description of the general principles, but we did not have strict rules for the design of the experiment and the statistical analysis. With the new approach, we have clear minimum requirements for experimental design of field trials. We have novel criteria for appropriate evaluation of natural variation. And this is very important because this morning, a lot of people were discussing, this afternoon, when is something biologically relevant. And you can assess that by estimating what is the degree of natural variation to make sure that your GM falls in what is biologically relevant or not. And then we can ensure a larger statistical power and a high efficiency. This will lead to harmonization across dossier, and harmonization means a faster risk assessment process because it's going to be more efficient. The dossier will have a similar structure, and it will be easier for the panel to assess the information contained in a more harmonized manner. And also will allow a better interpretation of differences or lack of equivalence within the risk assessment framework, and this is going to improve transparency of the whole process. A quick example of the design, that we provide very specific instruction on how to design the field trials. We have strict rules on how the GM and its conventional counterpart have to be planted together with conventional varieties in the field. And we have detailed description on how the different location must be chosen around the world. The red dots in the North and South American are just an example. These are not what we're going to ask, but we have a minimum number of sites required, which are 8, to try to capture as much of the environmental variation as possible, which is the real objective of the field trials, to answer the question, how is this GMO going to perform in different environmental conditions? We want to be 100% certain that we will not have unintended effects when grown in different types of environment. This slide hides a lot of statistical work behind, but I promise there are no numbers, as you can see. And we have two tests, a test of difference and a test of equivalence proposed in this new guidance. The first to verify whether the GMO is different from the non-GM comparator, and the second to make sure to verify if the GMO falls within what is called natural variation. And so we can clarify if a difference is biologically or not relevant, and whether it falls or not within the natural range of variation. This novelty is really going to make a difference because it's making the concept of substantial equivalence now measurable in an objective and solid way. The second example is the selection of comparator, which is the tool needed to implement the principle of substantial equivalence. As it was already mentioned, we have a public consultation ongoing on the new opinion, draft opinion on the comparator selection, and we will have a consultative workshop in March 2011, where several relevant issues are discussed. Stacks, cases in which we have crops with enhanced properties where the comparative approach may or may not be applicable depending on the property of the plant. And so we're going to tackle all those controversial issues that are causing problems in the application, maybe are causing problems in the application of the concept of substantial equivalence. So in summary, it's a document for applicants to follow, for evaluators to assess the risk assessment performed by the applicant. It's more prescriptive, but we do not change the principle of before. So now we should have a better harmonization, but not a change in the concept and the principle that have been implemented so far. Final slides. Does EFSA work in isolation or in an international context? No, EFSA does not work in isolation. We have a legislation that is indicating to us what we have to perform. The concept of the comparative approach was developed by Codex Alimentarius in 2003 and is accepted by OECD, FAO, WHO. And this is a common foundation. There are different countries applying different levels of requirements. But honestly, EU has the most stringent ones, as it was indeed recognized earlier by the other speakers. So we are really carefully checking all the data available for every application. And I thank you for your attention.
Je vous remercie, Madame Paoletti.
Thank you, Mrs. Paoletti, not just for your words, but also your spirit of succinctness. You didn't need my reminder for 1 minute left. I'll use George's approach and take questions 3 by 3. Who'd like to ask a question? Please do recall your name and your position. Sir, Madam, and Sir in the back. Yes, go ahead, sir.
My name is Piero Morandini. I'm from the University of Milan and a member of PRRI, the Organization of Public Sector Scientists. My main question is, what is the logic behind selecting, or better, singling out transgenic varieties for all the... My question is for Professor Seralini, of course, but if any other can answer is welcome. So what is the logic of selecting transgenic varieties for all these further tests you require, when you can have other varieties like herbicide-tolerant varieties or insect-resistant varieties which can be produced by traditional breeding, by mutation breeding, by natural variation, and can have maybe affected the same genes. So what is the reason of selecting just those producing by these techniques and not by the other techniques? I do not see any scientific logic in this. Thank you.
My name is Stefanie Hunsdorfer. I'm from Greenpeace European Unit. I have one question to Monsieur Seralini and one to Madame Paoletti. Monsieur Seralini, it is widely known that independent research on risks in Europe is quite difficult or quite rare. In December 2008, 27 environment ministers unanimously called for independent and systematic risk research on GMOs to be done. That's something that's by now lacking. Can you perhaps explain us why this is so difficult to do in Europe? And my second question, I think we all agree that how EFSA guidances look on paper is not the crucial thing as far as the implementation is not sufficient. So the crucial thing is the implementation. And there, a major problem that we see is that EFSA, and I'm talking about its final opinions, does not duly consider member states' authorities' concerns as well as independent scientists' results that are published in peer-reviewed studies. I'm not talking about the process. I know that EFSA has many formal steps to make consultations with member states' authorities and so on. I'm talking about the final opinions. Could you perhaps explain to us how do you want to change this? Thank you very much.
Xavier Bourgeois, je suis jeune agriculteur en Belgique.
I'm a young farmer in Belgium, member of a farmers association. For 10 years now, we have been obliged to produce proteins without using GMOs. These the feedstuffs we're supposed to use for animals, the same applies. Now, the thing is, when you now buy Belgian beef in supermarkets, you don't know whether they're produced with or without GMOs because of the confusion. The consumer just don't know. Now, we've heard opinions for and against GMO feedstuffs in Europe, but there's a lack of clarity at the moment, certainly in Belgium, and the ones suffering above all are the producers, I think. Replies?
Monsieur Serralini?
Okay, it is a good question. What is the logic? We would be happy to enter, if there are any competing plants that do compete Roundup Ready soy, and it would be Roundup Ready soy without GM modification, it should be included, of course, in the legislation. But there is no plant like that right now. So the herbicide tolerance obtained by mutagenesis, cultivated on wide areas or on big areas in the world, do not exist right now. But if it would exist, no, not on a big area, there is no big herbicide tolerance with. Okay, we are talking about edible foods. We can eat some flour, but generally they are natural. But the logic is important to know that, first, in Europe, we have a labeling system for GMOs, and we are talking about the regulation 1829/203, which is designed for GMOs. So we are talking in that context. For other agricultural plants, of course, if they are designed to contain new pesticides, we should include them in this regulation. About the independent research, it is also very important to notice that since the last 50 years, on the 150,000 chemical products, and for the last 15 years for the major 30 GMOs all over the world, I'm talking about agricultural GMOs. I have nothing against biotechnology in itself, of course. For these products, there was no independent test on an OCDE level because that necessitates millions of euros, and that is not performed by public research to test commercial products usually. So we are crucially lacking lacking not only of independent research but also of contradictory expertise. And what we propose to go out of that is to have systematically the company not spending the money to pay private firms to do their own tests and to have confidentiality on these results, but also to give the same money to the government in order to EFSA, for instance, to request independent testing, and this will be submitted to contradictory expertise and not only soft consensus expertise. For the breeders, it is a very good issue, and I would suggest you to ask, since the last 15 years, since you are losing money, to request from the biotech companies the blood analysis of the beef that have been submitted to GMOs in order to know why there is a problem. And that would be a way to go further in the debate. So maybe if you have some metabolic differences with the normal beef, then you would be happy to have normal beefs in the future. Of course, the government should allow the labeling of that, like they did recently in France for several retailers that have made some GM fed-free meat, for instance.
Yes, regarding the collaboration with the member states in the frame of the overall opinion, well, I can point out several things. First, EFSA has, since in the past, EFSA was not publishing Annex G, where we answer to every specific question raised by the member states and addressed in the opinion. In fact, the answers in Annex G make clear reference to the section of the opinion where the issue is considered in the text. EFSA presents to the member states. Every opinion is invited regularly by the European Commission to present the opinion and take eventually even more questions. We do consult the member states for 3 months for every single dossier, so there is an intense collaboration on both confidential and non-confidential information. And in addition, we have regular meetings with member states on different issues, and I have a list of examples I could provide. And the guidance document is not done in isolation by EFSA, but it is done in collaboration with the member states. In fact, the latest version has gone through public consultation, and it has not yet still published, if you look at my time frame, because for a long period, in addition to including new work done by EFSA on different issues like allergenicity, statistics which I have illustrated, and also the new novelty on comparator work, we have worked closely with the Commission and the Member States, because this will be embedded also in a normative document, and therefore the Member States have to adopt the principle of the document. So I really think that the Member States are quite involved on a general principle, horizontal issue, but on the specific for each and every single application, and therefore opinion being published at the end.
Une série de 3 autres questions. Vous avez vu que monsieur...
We have 3 other questions, but in the meantime, you'll see that Commissioner Dalli has just arrived.
Je vous propose...
I suggest we take questions now for 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'd like to ask the speakers to give us a 2 to 3 minute summary of everything they've said, just to put the Commissioner in the picture, and then we'll be hearing from the Commissioner for the final address. Questions, please?
George? And? Which? Ah, okay. Alors, first.
Yes, Jürgen Binder, GMO for Europe. Madame Paoletti, you explained that the work of the EFSA is based on the theory of sustainable equivalence. Why can something be patented if it is equivalent to the mother plant?
I'm sorry.
I've got 2 questions I want to put. I've listened to Professor Sarlini, and he's certainly very passionate in his presentation, and you hold very strong views about this issue. You made many assertions about the potential risks of biotech and GM plants. Now, I'm not a scientist, therefore I'm not in the business of trying to challenge your scientific view. But it seems to me, in listening and trying to come to some sort of conclusion on all of this, is that what you are actually in effect saying is that the public servants and the health safety organisations in many countries around the world, the elected politicians, are deliberately gambling with the lives of their population, because that's fundamentally what you are seeking out to say. You're also, I think, by definition, saying that health ministers in the European countries are derelict in their duty by not preventing European citizens from travelling to these countries and eating and being exposed to these products. Now, is that really what you believe? Is that truly your view on this? The second question, I think, is to our friend here from EFSA, Claudia Poletti. You've listened to Professor Sarlini. has EFSA taken into account his concerns and evaluated it, and has there been independent research done to try and assess whether there's validity in his concerns or otherwise?
Dernière question, au fond.
Last question over there at the back.
Sebastian Olini. I'm a biotechnologist and environmental scientist by education, but also a journalist. I would like, first of all, to relativize a little bit the question of independent science. It's always very relative. Just to quote, for example, Monsieur Serralini, I know that your research, for example, has been supported by Carrefour as well as from a foundation which is largely supported by organic farmers. So independence is always also a question of a certain standpoint, of course. And secondary, I would like to ask why BT is so much attacked when it's part of a GMO, and why it's not attacked when it's used as a pesticide by organic farmers. Because throughout Europe and throughout the world, BT is a very important organic pesticide. It's allowed also for usage in Europe. So I'm wondering where this difference is coming from. Thank you.
Souhaite commencer à répondre.
Who wants to start with the replies, please?
Madame Paoletti.
Regarding the question if EFSA has taken into account Professor Serralini's concern, I think I can answer yes. We have a long history, I would say, several years that we have contact with Professor Serralini. We have addressed his papers. The panel has replied to his paper in publishing statements as an answer, and there has been, let me allow to use this wording, a dialogue, an open dialogue, scientific dialogue between EFSA and Professor Serralini on some issues, especially concerning statistical analysis of 90-day feeding studies. We have had also personal contact before. Professor Serralini was invited to EFSA to discuss in some further details some of the issues. The panel is fully aware, and I think that in this open dialogue that is available for everybody on the website of EFSA, it's possible to really scrutinize the details of Professor Serralini's position and the panel position at length. Obviously, there are some diverging views, but I think that they have been fully addressed by EFSA panel. Regarding the question of being fully equivalent, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. What you're really asking is if something is equivalent, why this shouldn't be commercialized? Is that what you are asking me? I mean, I'm not sure I'm answering, but what is the job of the EFSA GMO panel is to verify if something is equivalent to its conventional counterpart. And then the issue of authorizing or not is outside the remit of EFSA, is a management decision that is up to the Commission. EFSA is only performing a risk assessment, the evaluation of a scientific risk assessment, and providing an opinion on that. The management is not within the remit of EFSA.
About the independence of scientists, first, of course, Christian and scientists like me are independent of biotech company, which is a necessary thing. We are not independent of the world, of course. And if any food company asks for more health tests on nutrition or on safety and expertise on safety, I would be happy to give the knowledge we have, whatever this food store is. Moreover, they don't really support my research. Carrefour doesn't really support the research, but requested to Cregen some contradictory expertise. We discussed with Dr. Paoletti, but also with EFSA in general in an open way. That's true. And we disagree on the conclusions. For instance, if EFSA says that, and this will also answer to you, sir, who asked the question about what I really think. I think that, for instance, for the Amflora potato that has been authorized for to feed the pigs, it is not scientifically sound to have based that concerning the test on mammals on only 10 rats on 30 and only during 90 days. So I think that we cannot assume that this is good for all Europe with so small tests. And my advice would be, when you have a question about if you are giving long-term health to the population, either in Europe or North America or elsewhere, you just have to look what are the blood analysis of the longest tests that have been performed on mammals before authorization, and then you will see the big hole between the reality and the so-called scientific sound science. Because here there is almost nothing, 50 parameters only during 90 days, and when there is a statistical difference admitted by everybody with a low statistical power, the low statistical power is initially due to the fact that EFSA accepted only 10 rats measured on 20, for instance, on the Moët 10, 20 per group. So that means 80 rats on 400 studied that were eating GMOs in the 90-day tests. So the statistical power is entirely due to that first, and due to the design of the experiment. So when you ask if there is any problem on the long term, then you should understand that in general in our world, we begin by short-term testing of new technology, and if anything goes wrong, then it's the public health that will be the key of the story and sacrificed on the long term. Of course, we are taking care of the short-term things, but if everything would be nice, then there would not be so much environmental pollution and problem in the biodiversity today in the world. So I think that we need improvement taking care about these issues, and this improvement is really easy to apply in science, but we need not to accept everything like it is performed today. And I think that in the guidelines we have some improvements possible, but we also need to make some compulsory obligatory tests for long-term testing. That means not for 10 years, but only the life of a mammal, which is 2 years, for instance, in order to have more indications if these statistical findings lead to pathological diseases or not. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, je vais demander...
Thank you. And I'd now like to ask each of these speakers, the 4 speakers we've just had, to just talk to us for 3 minutes, giving us a summary, basically, the essence of what they've had to say to us for the benefit of Commissioner Dalli, so that he is up to date on the debate this afternoon. I think it's worth going through this exercise so that Mr. Dalli, as I say, can be aware of how far we've got in our debate.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Commissioner, in my presentation I have summarized the food and feed guidance of EFSA for the risk assessment of GM plants. I have highlighted the foundation of the guidance, which is the principle of the comparative approach, which is internationally accepted and embedded in the European regulation. I have illustrated what are the novelties that will be present in the new version of this food feed guidance document based on the recent scientific work and research that has been done within EFSA during the past 3 years. in light of that, I have illustrated two examples. One dealing with the very important issues, which is the design of field trials and the evaluation of the obtained results, because EFSA has developed a novel approach trying to provide a novel method to objectively measure equivalence. So it's not just anymore a word to say is within the range of natural variation, but we can say how much is something within the range of natural variation. And I have illustrated some other examples in which EFSA is addressing some controversial issues, which will become even more controversial in the future, where more difficult dossiers will reach our table in terms of, for example, stacked events in which more than one transformation is inserted in the same plants. I'm thinking also of enhanced crops with particular nutritional properties, where the comparative approach may need to be recalibrated or revised to provide a full, reliable safety assessment of the GMO under consideration. And I have indicated a little bit how all the work that we are doing within EFSA is really well and solidly framed in an international context, which does not leave EFSA in isolation, and not only an international context at the European level, but also outside with other organizations.
Merci, je vous remercie aussi pour...
Thank you. And thank you for being so brief. Now, Mr. Seralini, 3 minutes.
Mr. Commissioner, I have underlined the fact that up to date, we only have for the commercial edible GMOs in the environment 100 so-called pesticide plants. That means plants, mostly soya and maize, that have been modified in order to contain new pesticide residues, such as Roundup Ready residues up to high levels in the American administration, for instance, and new Bt insecticide toxins residues that are brand new in comparison to natural ones. It is abnormal to assess that only during 3 months on mammals with blood analysis. Of course, there can be some nutritional tests over that, but for the blood analysis, we have to assess long-term health effects. We only have 3-month delay. It is completely abnormal to say to the entire European population that everything is safe if we have mostly in the real world only that to conclude. And there are statistical findings. We all agree, Monsanto, EFSA, and us, the scientists from the European network and from CRIGEN and others, 1,200 scientists have signed for the necessity of contradictory expertise and transparency in this field. So it is very important, Mr. Commissioner, and it's a very important petition of scientists requesting more science in the field. We have noticed that these statistical findings that can be up to 24 to 40% increase in grease in the blood of females fed with GMOs, they are always, for us, misinterpreted as non-relevant biologically, just because the effects are not linear with the dose. That means that they do not increase with the dose of GMO. There are only 2 doses tested, that they are not actually in both sexes, but this is ridiculous since you may have hormonal effects different in 2 sexes, and, for instance, that this is under a so-called historical norm which is not defined. So the statistical power of the test are low because, as I said, there are only a few animals in this test, and that should be rendered obligatory or compulsory before any release today, and there should be transparency. For instance, we suggest that on the Commission website or on the EFSA website there would be the raw data of all this blood analysis, so that any doctor in the world could give his own ideas on is it sufficient or not, 3 months on mammals to say for the entire world population that this is good. And we think that there could be some long-term effects on pathological disease that would be not seen with this kind of test. Thank you.
Merci. Madame?
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I have presented in a bit more than 15 minutes the outcome of the GMO panel and the presentation on the guidance document for the environment risk assessment of GM plants. I've presented the outline of the time frame under which this work has been done, starting with a mandate from the European Commission, highlighting 4 items to be updated, and I've explained that the panel has enlarged this 4 issue in the mandate to cover the whole environment risk assessment. I've presented the strategy developed by the panel in its environment risk assessment guidance document to have the principle of a case-by-case basis, being always scientifically sound, transparent manner, having the concept of familiarity and providing with a comparative approach. Then I've presented the 6th step of the environment risk assessment that are systematically required to go through in the environment risk assessment of any GM plant. And I've presented 5 cross-cutting considerations, which are issues that are of horizontal nature, which are developed in the guidance document, linked to the choice of comparator, the receiving environment, the long-term effect principle for statistics, and the stacked. Then I've gone through one example of a potential impact of GM plants on non-target organisms and how this approach is applied in that specific case. And in the last slides, I have highlighted the work which is ongoing now on the post-market environmental monitoring, mentioning that so far in the guidance document, the post-market environmental monitoring has not been updated, but we received recently a request from the Commission, from the European Commission, to update that chapter, and that we are also assessing the annual report from 2009. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Leroux.
Thank you, Mrs. Hillback, to wind up this round of the table.
Bien. Et bonjour, Monsieur
Thank you, and good afternoon, Commissioner.
This is my French. I'm sorry, I returned to English. It was enough to trick you into. I did, lastly, a critical appraisal of the revised guidelines by EFSA, and began with actually truly appraising and applauding EFSA for the enormous effort they put into the revision of the guidelines, and that we acknowledge that great progress was made in them. In particular for one part, which was a non-target risk assessment session. Of course, it was rewarding for me to recognize that this improvement was based on a concept that has been developed by a large group of international scientists that I had the pleasure to lead together with a professor from the US. And so obviously it's very rewarding to see that this has been taken up in the guidelines now. However, it's what I do find, or we find, this has been a joint product, is that the document is a bit split in its approach. While great progress has been made in some sections, in other sections we feel there is still a great need of clarification, and we had also some concerns. And a concern was regarding the tiered approach that has been proposed, because it seems to allow for the possibility that a GM plant can actually receive market approval based on biosafety data that are exclusively from closed environment experiments, which we would find inappropriate, as for the same reason as it would be inappropriate to grant market approval on a GMO plant if it's only based on efficacy data from the lab. The same rules apply, it's biology and ecology. And we also have even greater concern with an additional principle that has been introduced by EFSA, and we're not quite sure whether that fulfills the mandate, and it's what is called the comparative safety assessment, which is a rephrasing of the concept of substantial equivalence that has now been is used as a safety assessment, which is, in our view, if you read other regulations of the EU, in clear contradiction, where it's explicitly said it is not a safety assessment tool. It's an entry point or an issue that's integrated in a risk assessment, but it's not a safety assessment tool that, in this case, is preceding the risk assessment in the way it's laid out. So I think this also needs to be legally looked at, whether this is in compliance with other regulations. And because we have seen, or one way to interpret it, it could act as an upstream block to exclude certain GMOs from then going into the risk assessment. So it just doesn't make sense to have a safety assessment prior to a risk assessment where you actually are supposed to assess the safety. So it's a bit illogic, based on criteria in particular that have not been defined or described what they are in nature and what the requirements are for that. So that was our biggest concern, and we really urge EFSA and the legal advisors to give a close look to that. And lastly, the problem formulations section that has been included in the risk assessment, which is also a new element, but a less controversial element. In principle, we all agree that such a step should exist, except the concept that has been included exclusively or looked at is one that's been put forward by the biotech industry, and it has done so without considering, at least publicly viewable for us, other approaches that have been developed specifically for risk assessment of GMOs have been tested in trials, and no mention of these concepts have been made, no assessment and no evaluation why and why not. One has agreed on only exclusively looking into one proposal, which would not find the agreement of a larger scientific community. So we, all in all, we would suggest, in order to see how the procedure actually falls out and falls into place, we would recommend that a dry run, a test run is being done with these guidelines to see how it falls out and whether our concerns are materialize or maybe not materialize. And so we understand, because if they materialize, there would actually be a backslash. We would be left with weaker regulations than we have right now, and that cannot be in the interest of anybody in this process. So that's been largely my points.
Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, we'd like to thank you for being with us today, and I'll give you the floor straight away.
Thank you very much, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank Madame Lepage and Mr. Lyon for organising this conference and the invitation to participate in this debate. As the title of this conference is Risk Evaluation, I think everybody here can agree that this can only be based on solid science. Therefore, my approach is to follow science-based decision-making based on a thorough risk assessment in line with the legislation. The fact that the EU authorization procedure, which is generally considered to be the world's strictest system of authorizing GMOs, and the science behind it, is subject to lively and often controversial debate in the European Union, shows how relevant this seminar is today. Guaranteeing safety is one of my priorities, and I want to do this whilst listening to consumers and societal concerns. Only in this way will the best available scientific knowledge respond to the needs of society. To move forward in a fruitful manner, I would like to see everybody concerned coming around the table and discussing, not only today, but also in the coming months in different forums we will be setting up. Let me underline that such discussions must be done with an open mind, in a transparent manner, separating where possible identified risks from potential risks and facts from perceptions, so that these can be tackled separately. Let me first use the revision of the food and feed guidelines as an example. This revision involved extensive public and stakeholder consultations, first by EFSA and then by the Commission. After EFSA's scientific revision, the Commission, in close cooperation with the Member States, transformed the guidelines into a legal document, into a proposal for a regulation, which will be adopted in the coming months. Our objective is that guidelines will reinforce the current requirements by providing legally binding provisions adopted with member state endorsement, reinforcing scientific aspects by imposing internationally agreed protocols, specifying the objectives which have to be fulfilled at each stage of the risk assessment, and establishing a protocol for the comparative analysis for GMOs. There is a lot of misunderstanding on the strategy for risk assessment and the so-called concept of substantial equivalence. In fact, the strategy is quite simple to understand. A thorough comparison between a GMO and the conventional safe counterpart allows the identification of all the differences created by the genetic modification. Therefore, equivalence is not similarity, but it's a process to bring out the differences between the subjects that are being examined. This is in fact the starting point of the safety assessment. All these differences are then investigated in detail with respect to possible toxicological, allergenicity, or nutritional aspects. This is a sound scientific strategy that is followed by all authorities throughout the world, as described in the guidelines established in 2004 by the Codex Alimentarius, which is the internationally recognized body for establishing food safety requirements. In addition, there are a number of key aspects that we have identified during the process, listening to the views and concerns of member states and stakeholders. I will mention two. First, the 90-day studies with rats using the whole food, which are currently performed on a case-by-case basis. Work is ongoing to reinforce these studies through a specific protocol. I have asked my services to reflect on the need to have such studies done in all cases. For the sake of transparency, I want to underline that companies already carry them out in almost every case on their own initiative. Secondly, the important issue of concern for many is the use of antibiotic resistance marker genes. I passed a very clear message to Eurobio over the last months, including in their recent innovation event on the 9th of December, insisting to step up efforts to phase out antibiotic resistance marker genes. The food and feed guidelines will reflect this approach. As a result, I believe that we have arrived to a document that is updated to technical progress and that also addresses main areas of concerns. Allow me now to refer briefly to another topic you mentioned in the subtitle of your seminar, the need to reinforce the real and perceived independence of the risk assessment. EFSA has in place a whole set of procedures aiming to prevent conflicts of interest. This will still be reinforced in the near future. The Commission is reflecting on the possibility to finance independent studies that would repeat tests provided by companies for some GMOs. In relation to the availability of company data, I want to make clear that the rules regarding confidentiality of authorization files limit to the absolute minimum the information that can be regarded as confidential. This means that only names of people and the detailed genetic sequence may be kept confidential, whilst all the rest, such as the tests made on animals, cannot be confidential. They are provided to anyone upon request. The risk assessors and risk managers of the 27 member states obviously have access to the whole dossier, confidential and non-confidential information, from the start of the risk assessment phase. I have also asked the Eurobio to ensure that GM seeds are made easily available for researchers to reveal any tests that are part of the risk assessment. Companies need to continue improving transparency and access to their data proactively. Let me move now to the environmental risk assessment guidelines, which will also go through this two-stage process. First, the scientific revision led by EFSA, and subsequently, the transformation into a legal text to be endorsed by member states. EFSA published the much-awaited revision of the guidelines on the environmental risk assessment, as requested by the 2008 Environment Council conclusions on the 12th of November. The Commission launched discussions with member states 1 month later, on the 13th of December last year. We had planned to hold a second meeting to discuss these environmental risk assessment guidelines at the beginning of February, but member states have asked for extra time. We will consequently discuss these guidelines again with member state experts in March. As with the food and feed guidelines, EFSA carried an extensive consultation in 2 rounds, involving NGOs, industry and other stakeholders, as well as member states. The Commission will also demand stakeholders' input once a draft legal text is ready, including members of the European Parliament. Finally, I would like to stress the importance of monitoring. We have to undertake effective monitoring of GMO cultivation by companies and by member states to ensure the accuracy of scientific assessments and to refine our techniques for future assessments. Significant work has been done in this regard. EFSA is revising its guidelines for post-market monitoring, which will be ready in July 2011. This updated chapter on monitoring will be subsequently integrated into the environmental risk assessment guidelines. We count on the active and constructive input from member states and from all stakeholders with a view to achieving the swift adoption of these guidelines through comitology. When I meet NGOs and MPs who are vocal about GMOs, I keep asking them to make sure that their scientists and advisors get actively involved in this process. I would like to meet with members of the European Parliament throughout this process. To conclude, I would like to underline that underpinning resolute safety, efforts must be made to improve transparency and dialogue by all of us. I am personally committed to active and better dialogue and look forward to the following up of today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Commissioner. Can we take 2 or 3 questions, if you agree, Mr. Commissioner? 3 questions then. First 3. 1, 2, 3. That's it. Madam.
Dame là-bas. Madame. You. You, yes. You. Uh-huh.
Mon nom c'est Veli.
My name is Veliki. I am a physician and a computer expert. I am a European citizen and I'm a consumer. I have a question, which I already asked before, but there hasn't been a response given. Not a clear one anyway. The long-term tests on animals and humans are completely missing from all of the scientific bodies, be the European or otherwise. Now, why? I was told that the long-term scientific tests are difficult. They're not difficult. For long-term tests, normally, we use a pilot farm, for example, in different countries. Do you have any information regarding these tests? Secondly, what I'm missing here is the farmer's opinion. They're the ones that have these animals using a defined quantity of these plants from genetically modified organisms, and they use it every day, and we're missing the veterinarians' opinions as well. In the long term, we have these problems. This is the type of analysis that needs to be carried out. There's no kind of indication given regarding all of that.
Okay. To me, it seems that much of the controversy around what Professor Seralini is finding in the data and what Monsanto is finding and what EFSA is concluding is that we have no agreement and no common understanding what is a biologically relevant parameter and what is the level, the cutoff level, from what level and degree of damage on do we consider it a damage and beyond what is what we accept. So Professor Seralini clearly shows there is statistical differences, there is effects, and from what I understand, EFSA says, well, yes, we acknowledge that, but we don't consider this biologically relevant enough to take action on it. So what this seems to suggest is that we need to come to a clear agreement. If a statistically significant effect is there, what parameter is it and what level of effect do we accept and beyond which do we have to act? Because this is now, in essence, interpretation versus interpretation, and that's where all the controversy comes around. So my question is, do you have that? Although I think I know you don't, but maybe you can educate me and you do have cutoff levels and, you know.
Madam? My name is Mute Schimpf. I'm working for Friends of Europe. I want to start with a remark. Today, several of the participants and of the panelists confirmed and agreed that the authorization systems should be science-based. And the big majority understands science-based just as biology. But science is more than biology. Also, economic is an science, and so if you discuss of a whole authorization system, I think further aspects should be considered, or we would rather say must be considered. This is just a remark. I have one small question for which procedure will be used to implement the two guidelines for food and feed and also for the environmental risk assessment made by community or implementing power or by a co-decision. And more a political question is, we have different open dossiers in the GM policy. We have these two new guidelines, we have a debate for the socio-economic assessment of the impact of a cultivation, and we have other topics which are still under consideration and discussion. So we are really wondering if the Commission will wait for next authorization until we have finalized at least a big majority of these open dossiers, or when would you recommend the next authorization for a GM crop?
Monsieur le Commissaire, si vous voulez bien répondre à ces trois questions.
Not being a scientist myself, I have to be very reticent sometimes on the type of questions, but on most of the issues that were raised, I can give an opinion. The fact that the statement that long-term tests are missing, okay, and that these tests can be organized. My point of view, personally, and this is what I am bringing into this debate since I took office and with responsibility of the GMO dossiers, is that being responsible, finally, and by default, I say, in the authorizations of GMOs, and I say by default because this is not a commission function, it is a member state function, and we simply get involved in authorizing them because member states don't seem to come to a decision. So this is basically what the real situation is, neither a no nor a yes. And this is why the Commissioner will have to step in and put his head on the block and take the decision that sometimes is obviously indicated. So my responsibility is that I want to have, as much as possible, all the facts and all the correct facts when making the final decision, because I do feel the responsibility for the safety of our citizens, as much as I feel the responsibility that Europe has to still go on in the innovation field. Therefore, we have to balance out this issue, not balanced out by sacrificing one for the other, but making sure that one is working with the other to make sure that we are progressing together. And this is why, in fact, we are opening up this debate. And this is why I am asking everybody involved, whoever has an interest in this subject, to come forward and make an objective contribution to this debate. We want to listen to facts. We want to listen to real assessments, and then we have to come with solutions. So if, for example, we can go for some long-term tests, I think we should be going for long-term tests. But what I would say is that we have to take the decision at a certain point in time, and finally, what is long-term? I mean, 5 days can be long-term in certain instances. 50 years cannot be long-term in other instances. So basically also, what we need to do is, and that is what we are emphasizing, is to have the proper monitoring systems as well, even after post-market, that will give us all the feedback necessary that will improve our science and also test that the decisions that has been taken were the correct decisions in the first place. So I personally, and my services, I can assure you, are totally open to any practical opinion, solution, and improvement that we can do with the process. I want to end this series of debates that we're going to have, and I'm going to be asking and inviting many stakeholders to debates like this, because I want to come up with a situation where we have what we are satisfied to be a robust system of authorization that would put the minds of most of us at peace. I wouldn't say all of us, because that seems to be impossible. I agree that we have to have the input of all concerned, including farmers, including veterinarians, who are not only interested, but who also can give us observations and inputs into what is actually happening in the actual real life. So I agree with that. I agree also with the comment that what we have here, and we have been having in the past, is the conflict of interpretation with interpretation. And this is what we have to break. This is the vicious circle we have to break. We have to agree on scientific parameters, on scientific protocols that everybody can live with. This is the exercise that we are embarking on. Okay? We have to make sure that the interpretation is an interpretation that is accepted. So again, it seems that in the scientific world, like in many other sectors and worlds, universality is not possible. But at least that we'll have the possibility to say that the extravagant majority of scientific opinion goes this way. And then the minority of opinions will have to be listened to, will have to be acted upon, but will not be there to weigh finally the final decision that will come out. But at the end, I believe that we have to come out of this process with as much proper definitions, proper protocols that would put a lot of this interpretation versus interpretation conflict to rest. I also agree totally with the fact that when we talk about assessments, we're not just talking about biological assessments, we're also talking about other assessments. In fact, again, one of our insistence is that we have to take into account economic and environmental issues, not just biological issues. And I am also insisting that I would like to have, as the commissioner who, as I said before, is responsible to take the final decision, I would like to know what is in it for us human beings in these developments. What are the benefits to society that are going to accrue out of these developments that we are making? Is it simply more production and more profits for certain companies? Or is it also benefits for society in all aspects, be it social, for example, developing plants that could resist drought or other things that could be helpful in certain areas, which would be a benefit, or else other types of advantages. So I would like also to know, and I'm insisting that in every event that we will be considering, we will also have an indication of what is the benefits that are going to accrue to us as a society, which is very, very important. As far as how the decisions are going to be made, as far on any conclusions, it will be through comitology. This is what the process is. I don't know whether I've touched on all the issues. I've tried to. Thank you.
Alors, il nous revient à George Lyon.
Well, it remains for George Lyon and myself to conclude. Since I started, George will finish. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for your words. I'll come back to them in a moment. Please be reassured, I'm going to impose the same rule on myself as I did to others, 5 minutes. So, again, thank you, Mr. Commissioner, and thank you to our speakers. I think everything that's been said has been important, and I'd like to thank the audience for the quality of the questions and the quality of the debate. I mean, some said, well, how on earth are we going to organize a debate? It's going to be very heated. There won't be organized. No one will agree or be able to say things in words and a tone that remains courteous and allows for the debate to make progress. But I would like to thank you because I think thanks to all of you, it was possible. Mr. Commissioner, I entirely agree with your words, and I'd thank you for the significant progress that you mentioned today. The subject of contradictory expertise, which for me and many others is a very important issue, and the fact that we allow for long-term studies, the making available of seeds for research purposes, which today is impossible. And what you said about the participation of other researchers. Also, what you said about managing conflicts of interest, which is an extremely important issue. All of that, I think, responds to many concerns we have all expressed, and I thank you for your comments on that. You also said that we have to get out of this impasse. I think we all agree on that. I mean, if we met today, that was our aim. There's no goodwill and badwill on one side or the other. There are people with different approaches to the same subject, but probably common concerns. That is, to do things well. Perhaps the order of priorities are not necessarily the same. Some feel that health, consumers' health and the quality of the environment must take precedence. Others feel that economic development and research are absolutely essential so that we don't become, as you referred to, Madam, marginalized. 3 points. To get out of the impasse, we've got to convince public opinion. You have a majority of European consumers who don't want them, and this is growing. There's a petition from 1 million persons that has been filed. I know there are debates about this petition. Nonetheless, that is the first subject on which the Europeans decided to apply the new provisions of the treaty. I mean, that's not a neutral issue. That means that this is a subject that is extremely politically important for our citizens. Therefore, if we want to get out of the impasse, it is going to be through working with our citizens. by perhaps trying to demonstrate, maybe we'll succeed, maybe we won't, but that's the issue, that the way in which they feel their interests, that is their health, their freedom to consume, their freedom to use their space, are entirely respected, and that is the main objective. Second point, the debate on the guidelines. That was open today. You said yourself, Mr. Commissioner, we will have other opportunities to discuss them. Well, these guidelines have got to represent progress. Mrs. Hilbeck said there is progress on the one hand, but there's concerns on the other. The definition you gave of the substantial equivalence principle, if it's set as low at the beginning, to move on from there, and if it's set on very low at the beginning to block any progress, that's another thing. But yes, I agree, we need to decide on the definitions. That is something very important. The analysis of long-term effects and the receiving environments, that's very important, and something we've got to get into, because this debate has demonstrated that there is great concern about these subjects. Secondly, the trust in the expertise. Several times, Mr. Commissioner, you talked about your responsibility. We all, as decision makers, you more than anyone else, because your name goes on the signature line. But we also are part of those who have individual and collective responsibility in this whole issue. And to be able to carry out this responsibility, we need to rely on expertise that we are entirely confident in, and this confidence is fundamental. For us to have this, this cancer of conflict of interest must be stopped. It's no longer possible. So I'm delighted that you told us that you are working to make progress on this. We cannot allow and continue to allow that people, I'm not talking about independent or not dependent, that's not the issue, but that they be at the same time representing major economic interests and public experts for the decision makers at the European Union level. That's not acceptable, and our citizens don't understand that. And that has, in fact, led to a sort of gangrene with everything, regarding everything that's said, whether it's true or not. So I do thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for your will to make progress on this, and I do hope that this debate this afternoon has allowed for some progress to be made in the good direction. Again, thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for your openness in your words.
Thank you, Corinne. I was just about to pass you the white. You were very much sticking to time. I'm going to be very brief because it's been a long session, and we've all heard the points of view, and Corinne summed up some of them very, very well. But it's very clear from the discussion here that I think there's a united view that here in the room that all the decisions on food safety must be based in science and fact. I think that's a pretty fundamental principle that we all start from, and that's very, very important. I think the second point, and the whole point of this exercise this afternoon, was to try and establish whether EFSA have been willing to listen, willing to engage with those who hold very diametrically different views and have real questions and challenges about process and about the whole authorisation process. I think we heard that they have been listened to. They have taken on board some of the criticisms, but clearly there are still areas where there are disagreement, and I don't think in any democracy you can ever have consensus. There will always be these different views. But the most important thing I think that I and Corinne wanted to establish was that at the very least EFSA was open, listening and willing to engage and take on board some of the criticisms, because otherwise we can't make progress on this issue whatsoever. I think we also heard today just a little bit of context from Professor McLaughlin, our Irish American friend, who demonstrated where the rest of the world is in the use of these new technologies and gave us some context about it. And whether we like it or not, there's a great experiment going on in the rest of the world that we are stepping aside from at the moment And indeed, in terms of long-term studies and that, we're 20 years into that in terms of where the USA and some of these other countries are. And quite clearly, it won't take long before it's established whether there are any real risks or otherwise. I think from her presentation, it's clear that Europe has the most robust authorisation procedures of anywhere in the world. I don't think there is anyone going to dispute that point of view. And I think it's worth remembering that there is no such thing as zero risk. You're all at risk sitting here. The roof may fall in you. You may walk out this building, cross the road and get knocked down by a bus. So zero risk, and being able to prove that there is no risk whatsoever, they are propositions that clearly are untenable. And I think we should have that in the back of our mind in discussing a risk-based approach to any new technology, to any new methods and practices that the humankind develops. The objective of this, again, was to make sure that we debate on the basis of facts. And I think John Daly in his contribution made it very clear that he's willing to engage in that debate, provided it's on facts and scientific evidence, and that is very, very important. My last point is the benefits to society. Consumers are rightly concerned in Europe about the technology. There is no two doubts of that. Every survey suggests that. And at the moment, it's the fear that's overcoming the scientific facts and the best scientific opinion. And fear is an easy one for politicians to play, very easy game. And we all have tended to use it in the past. I'm always a great believer in the politics of hope, and I hope that on this one, the politics of fear can be overcome, and we can see some hope, some decent discussion about how we progress as a society using these new technologies in the future. That's the kind of discussion we have, and that's the objective we all want to try and arrive at. So, a final thank you to you, the audience, because you've been great. You've asked all the hard questions. Big thank you to all the contributors here who gave of their time, came along and spoke to us. And with that, can I just ask you to give everyone a big round of applause, yourselves and the contributors, because it's been an excellent. Two final points. There's a gentleman here called Mr. Vivian Moses who wishes to give the Commissioner a letter on behalf of a range of scientists from around Europe. And if you could do it just immediately after I conclude. Secondly, the free drink is on the 5th floor, and you take the main elevator to floor 5. Please don't get lost. There's quite a lot of alcohol to be consumed. Thank you very much indeed.